Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. Hey everyone, if you enjoy my content, don't forget to check out my second channel. The link is in the description or the comments. Your support means the world to me. This happened in the 1980s, 1986 to be exact. I always figured the job would be boring. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't looking for excitement when I signed up as a park ranger. But after 6 months of watching tourists throw sandwich wrappers into the woods and arguing with campers about fire regulations, you start to wonder if you made the right career choice. My name's Emmett Renford, and back in '86 I was stationed at Acadia National Park in Maine. I was 28 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in environmental science and a head full of ideals about preserving nature. I liked the quiet. I liked the solitude. But I never expected to come face to face with something that should have stayed buried in the woods. It was a typical morning in early October, cool and misty, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only one on Earth. The trees were just starting to turn, splashes of red and gold peeking through the evergreens. I was doing my usual rounds, checking campsites for litter, making sure people followed the leave no trace rules. The crunch of fallen leaves under my boots and the occasional call of a chickadee were the only sounds breaking the silence. That's when I got the call on the radio. The staticky voice of Hank, one of the senior rangers, crackled through. "Emmett, you there? We've got a situation." I pressed the button on my radio. "I'm here, Hank. What's going on?" "Couple of hikers went off trail yesterday, didn't make it back by sundown. Their car's still in the lot." I sighed. This wasn't unusual. It happens all the time. People think they can wander wherever they please, and it's usually just a matter of following the footprints back to where they veered off. But something in Hank's voice made me uneasy. "I'll head over to the trailhead," I said. "Meet you there." "Negative," Hank replied. "I need you to meet me by the old fire road. You know the one?" I frowned. The old fire road was barely more than a game trail now, overgrown and rarely used. Not many tourists even knew about it. "Yeah, I know it. Why there?" There was a pause, long enough that I thought we'd lost connection. Then Hank's voice came back, quieter this time. "Just meet me there, kid, and bring extra ammo." The radio went silent, leaving me with a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. I made my way to the old fire road, my mind racing. Hank wasn't one to get rattled. He'd been with the park for over 20 years, seen it all, or so I thought. When I got there, he was standing near the tree line, hands on his hips, staring into the woods like they were hiding something nasty. Hank was in his late 50s, with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much. He gave me a look that made my stomach drop, and without saying much, we started walking. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us. The mist hung low, turning the world into a gray haze. Our footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles and decaying leaves. "You ever hear about what happened in '73? Hank asked suddenly, his voice low. I shook my head. "No, what happened?" He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding whether to tell me. "Couple of people went missing just like this. Never found them. Park officials kept it quiet. Didn't want it messing with the visitor numbers." I wasn't sure what to say, so I kept quiet and followed Hank deeper into the woods. After about an hour of walking, the trail turned strange. It was like the trees were closing in even more, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The air felt thicker, almost hard to breathe. That's when we stumbled on the first sign. A backpack torn open like it had been mauled by something big. Dark stains that could only be blood smeared the fabric, and not far from it was what was left of one of the hikers. I've seen some bad stuff. People get hurt in the woods, animals don't mess around. But this wasn't an animal attack. The body looked like it had been chewed. Not clawed, not shredded, but gnawed on. Like whatever did it had teeth too big for its mouth. I felt the bile rise in my throat, but I forced it down. Hank was examining the remains without touching anything. He didn't seem fazed, which scared me more than anything else. "Guess we know why they didn't come back," he said, his voice flat. I swallowed hard. "What?" What could have done this? Hank didn't answer. He just stared at the corpse, his face unreadable. Then he reached for his radio. The rest of the search was a blur. We radioed it in, but instead of the usual response, sending a team or alerting the authorities, there was this weird pause, a long silence before the voice on the other end said, "Stay put, don't go any further." We didn't listen. We kept moving, deeper. I don't know why. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe Hank had seen something like this before and wasn't telling me. All I know is we should have turned back the moment we saw what was left of that poor hiker. But we didn't. As we moved further into the woods, we found more signs. Broken branches, deep grooves in the ground like something massive had scraped through. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence fell over the forest. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals. It was as if every living thing had fled. The second hiker was slumped against a tree, or at least what was left of him. His neck was twisted in a way that wasn't natural, like someone had wrung it out like a wet towel. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly into the mist. I had to turn away, fighting the urge to be sick. Hank didn't say much, neither did I. There wasn't much to say when you're looking at something that doesn't make sense. It wasn't long after that when we heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. Not a growl, not a roar, but something in between. It was like something was dragging itself through the underbrush, branches snapping under its weight. Hank raised his hand, motioning for me to stop. I wanted to ask if he'd heard it before, but the look in his eyes told me he had. We crouched behind a thick tangle of roots, eyes scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it. At first it didn't look like much, just a shadow moving between the trees. But then it stepped into a small clearing, and I felt my heart stop. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, even hunched over on all fours. Its body was long and sinewy, covered in what looked like a mix of coarse hair and something that resembled tree bark. The limbs were the wrong shape, too long and jointed in places they shouldn't be. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. It didn't have a face, not really. Just a flat expanse of leathery skin with 2 sunken pits where eyes should be. And below that, a mouth, a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth stretching impossibly wide across what passed for its head. I nudged Hank, my hand shaking. For a second I thought he was going to shoot it, but he didn't. Instead he whispered, "It doesn't see us. Don't move." Yeah, easier said than done when you're staring at something that looks like it crawled out of your worst nightmares. The creature sniffed the air, long fingers tipped with dull, worn-down claws scraping the ground as it moved. I noticed they didn't look sharp, more like they had been ground down from... Well, I didn't want to think about what could wear down claws like that. We stayed there, barely breathing, watching it circle the area. It moved with an unnatural grace, its body twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. Then it let out that awful sound again, like a deep, rattling cough, and turned back toward the deeper part of the woods. Hank motioned for me to follow as it moved away, and we did, careful not to make a sound. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the grim determination I saw in Hank's eyes. We followed it for what felt like hours, watching as it wandered through the woods, stopping occasionally to scratch at the ground or sniff the air. It was hunting, and from the looks of it, we were next on the menu. Eventually, it stopped, and that's when I saw it. It had a nest. Or maybe nest isn't the right word. It was more like a pit, a hollowed-out section of earth filled with bones. Not just animal bones either, human bones. Some fresh, others cracked and worn like they'd been there for years. I whispered to Hank, asking him if this was what he'd seen back in '73. He just nodded, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the trees. "Is this what got those hikers?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Hank looked at me, his eyes haunted. "This thing's been here for decades," he said, "and it doesn't leave. We should have left then, I know that now. But something in Hank told me he wasn't ready to walk away, not without taking a shot at the thing. Maybe he figured he owed it to those hikers. Maybe he wanted to put an end to whatever was lurking in these woods. Either way, he raised his rifle, took aim, and fired, The shot rang out, loud and echoing through the trees. The creature screeched, a sound so piercing it felt like it was tearing through my skull. Its head snapped in our direction, those empty eye sockets somehow finding us instantly. It moved faster than anything I've ever seen, charging at us with those long limbs swinging wildly. I didn't even have time to think. Hank fired again, but it barely slowed the thing down. I was knocked flat on my back, the breath leaving my lungs as it barreled past me and into Hank. It took one swipe, just one, and Hank was on the ground, not moving. I scrambled to my feet, pulling my own gun. I don't know what I was thinking. Shooting this thing wasn't going to do much good, but I had to try. I fired once, twice, 3 times. Each shot made it flinch, dark ichor oozing from the wounds, but it kept coming. Its mouth hung open, that impossible maw ready to swallow me whole. Then it stopped. It just stopped. Stared at me with that flat, empty face. It tilted its head like it was deciding whether or not I was worth the effort. For a second I thought maybe it wasn't going to kill me. Then it turned and loped off into the woods, disappearing into the mist as quickly as it had appeared. I ran to Hank, but it was too late. He was gone, his body limp and broken in the dirt. I radioed for backup, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. But it was no use. By the time they arrived, the thing was long gone, and all they found were the remains. The next few days were a blur of questions and confusion. Park officials swarmed the area, but they found nothing. No tracks, no nest, no sign of the creature. It was like it had vanished into thin air, taking all evidence of its existence with it. They told me not to say anything. Just like in '73, they wanted to keep it quiet. Didn't want the park turning into a ghost town, or worse, a hunting ground for thrill seekers and cryptid enthusiasts. But I couldn't keep quiet. Not about this. The nightmares started almost immediately. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. Its impossible body, its gaping maw. I heard Hank's last scream, saw the life drain from his eyes. I tried to tell people what I'd seen, my superiors, my co-workers, even a local reporter. But no one believed me. They chalked it up to trauma, to the stress of finding those poor hikers. Some even suggested I might have been the one responsible, that I'd snapped under the pressure and killed Hank myself. The worst part? When they finally dragged me out of those woods, one of the senior rangers looked at Hank's body, shook his head and said, "This isn't the first time." I guess Hank was right. That thing had been there for decades, maybe longer. I couldn't stay at Acadia after that. I quit my job, packed up my things, and left Maine altogether. But I couldn't escape the memories. They followed me, haunting my dreams and my waking hours alike. For years I tried to forget. I moved from place to place, never staying anywhere too long. I took odd jobs, anything to keep my mind occupied, but always in the back of my mind I knew it was still out there, waiting, hunting. It wasn't until 1992 that I finally found someone who believed me. I was working as a groundskeeper at a small college in Vermont when I met Dr. Eleanor Winters. She was a professor of folklore and mythology, with a particular interest in cryptozoology. At first, I was hesitant to share my story. I'd been laughed at and dismissed so many times before. But there was something about Dr. Winters that made me trust her. Maybe it was the way she listened, really listened, without judgment or skepticism. I told her everything, about the hikers, about Hank, about the creature. As I spoke, I saw recognition in her eyes. She'd heard stories like mine before. "What you encountered," she said after I'd finished, "sounds like what some Native American tribes call a Wendigo, a creature of insatiable hunger, cursed to wander the forests, always seeking its next meal." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But that's just a legend, right? A myth?" Dr. Winters smiled sadly. "Many myths have their roots in truth, Mr. Renford, and there are more things in this world than we can explain with our limited understanding of science." She showed me reports, newspaper clippings, eyewitness accounts, all describing something similar to what I'd seen, going back decades, even centuries. Always in the same general area, the forests of the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. "These creatures," Dr. Winters explained, "they're rare, but they're real, and they're ancient. Some believe they're as old as the forests themselves." I felt a mix of relief and terror. Relief that someone finally believed me, that I wasn't crazy. but terror at the confirmation that this thing, this Wendigo, was real, and that there might be more of them out there. Dr. Winters and I spent the next few years researching, gathering more evidence. We never went public with our findings. Who would believe us? But we did what we could to warn people, to keep them safe. Anonymous tips to park rangers, carefully worded warnings posted on hiking forums. But always in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't enough. That thing was still out there, still hunting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that one day I'd have to face it again. It was in the summer of 1998 that my fears were realized. Dr. Winters had received reports of increased disappearances in Acadia. Hikers going missing, search parties finding nothing but torn backpacks and inexplicable claw marks on trees. I knew I had to go back. I owed it to Hank, to those hikers, to everyone who'd fallen victim to that thing. Dr. Winters tried to talk me out of it, but she knew as well as I did that I was the only one who'd seen it and lived to tell the tale. So 12 years after I'd fled those woods, I found myself driving back to Acadia National Park. The familiar scenery brought back a flood of memories, not all of them bad. I remembered the quiet mornings, the beautiful sunsets, the sense of peace I'd once found in these forests. But underneath it all was a current of dread. I knew what was waiting for me in those woods. I checked into a small motel on the outskirts of Bar Harbor, using a fake name. I didn't want anyone recognizing me, didn't want to draw attention to myself. The next morning I headed into the park. It was strange being back. Everything looked the same, and yet everything had changed. Or maybe it was just me who'd changed. I was no longer the naive young ranger I'd been. I was older now, grayer, with eyes I was older now, grayer, with eyes that had seen too much. I made my way to the ranger station, my heart pounding. I didn't know if anyone would recognize me or what I'd say if they did. As luck would have it, the station was manned by a young ranger I didn't know. She couldn't have been more than 25, with bright eyes and an eager smile. It made my chest ache remembering when I'd been like that. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. I cleared my throat. "Yeah, I'm looking for information on recent disappearances in the park." Her smile faltered. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't discuss ongoing investigations with the public." I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. "Look, I used to work here. Back in '86, I know about the thing in the woods." The color drained from her face. She glanced around, then motioned for me to follow her into a back room. "How do you know about that?" she hissed once we were alone. I took a deep breath and told her my story, about the hikers, about Hank, about the creature. As I spoke, I saw the same mix of fear and disbelief I'd seen in so many faces over the years. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "There have been more disappearances, 3 in the last month. We've been told to keep it quiet, but people are scared. The locals know something's wrong." I nodded. "I need to go back out there, to where it happened." She shook her head vehemently. "No way. It's too dangerous. We've got teams searching, but they don't know what they're looking for," I interrupted. "I do." She stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. "I can't stop you, can I?" "No," I said, "you can't." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a map. "Here, this shows where the recent disappearances have been. Be careful, Mr. Renford. Whatever's out there, it's getting bolder." I took the map, my hand shaking slightly. "Thank you." As I turned to leave, she called out, "Mr. Renford, what does it look like?" I paused at the door, the memories flooding back. "Like nothing you've ever seen," I said softly, "and pray you never do." The next morning I set out at dawn. The familiar trail stretched before me, disappearing into the mist. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No bird song, no rustling of small animals. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. I followed the map to the areas of the recent disappearances. They formed a rough circle centered around the area where I'd encountered the creature all those years ago. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but little of its light penetrated the dense canopy. I found signs of the missing hikers, a torn backpack here, a broken camera there, but no bodies, no blood. It was as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. As the day wore on, I began to doubt myself. Maybe I was chasing ghosts. Maybe the trauma of what I'd seen had warped my memory, made me see monsters where there were none. But then I saw it, a footprint, massive, misshapen, pressed deep into the soft earth. My heart began to race. It was real. It was here. I followed the tracks, my hand on my gun. They led me deeper into the woods to areas I'd never seen before. The trees here were older, gnarled and twisted. Moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains. And then I heard it. That sound. That awful rattling cough that had haunted my nightmares for over a decade. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Slowly I turned, and there it was. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, its massive form hunched and twisted. In the pale light filtering through the trees, I could see it more clearly than I had all those years ago. Its skin was a patchwork of bark-like scales and matted fur, mottled with strange, pulsing growths. The limbs were even longer than I remembered, jointed in impossible ways. And the face, God, the face. It was like a nightmare given flesh. The skin was pulled tight over a skull-like visage, with deep empty sockets where eyes should be. But it was the mouth that held my gaze, that terrible gaping maw, filled with row upon row of jagged teeth. For a moment, neither of us moved. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as it regarded me with those empty eye sockets. Did it remember me? Did it even have that kind of intelligence? Then it moved, faster than anything that size had any right to move. I barely had time to dive out of the way as it charged, its claws raking the air where I'd been standing. I scrambled to my feet, fumbling for my gun. The creature wheeled around, its mouth opening in that horrible rattling roar. I fired once, twice, 3 times. The bullet struck home, dark ichor oozing from the wounds, but it didn't even slow down. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going. Behind me I could hear it pursuing, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I burst into another clearing and skidded to a stop. Before me was a sheer cliff face, at least 30 feet high. I was trapped. I turned to face the creature as it emerged from the trees. It moved slowly now, almost leisurely. It knew it had me cornered. As it approached, I noticed something, a scar on its chest, right where Hank had shot it all those years ago. This wasn't just any monster. This was the same one, the one that had haunted my nightmares for over a decade. "You remember me, don't you?" I said, my voice shaking. "You remember what we did to you?" The creature tilted its head as if considering my words. Then it let out a low, rumbling sound, almost like laughter. It was toying with me, playing with its food. I raised my gun again, knowing it was useless but unwilling to die without a fight. The creature tensed, ready to pounce, and that's when I heard it. A voice calling out from the woods. "Mr. Renford! Mr. Renford, where are you?" It was the young ranger from the station. She must have followed me. The creature's head snapped toward the sound. Fresh prey. In that moment of distraction, I made a decision. I charged at the creature, yelling at the top of my lungs. It turned back to me, surprised by my sudden aggression. We collided with a force that knocked the breath from my lungs. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through flesh and muscle. The pain was excruciating, but I held on, grappling with the monster as we teetered on the edge of the cliff. "Run!" I screamed, hoping the ranger could hear me. "Get out of here!" The creature roared, its fetid breath hot on my face. We struggled at the cliff's edge, a bizarre dance of man and monster. Then we were falling. The world spun around us as we plummeted. The creature's roar of rage turned to one of fear. We struck the ground with a sickening thud, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was lying in a crumpled heap at the base of the cliff. Every part of my body screamed in pain, but I was alive. Beside me lay the creature. Its body was broken, twisted at unnatural angles. Dark ichor pooled beneath it, but incredibly, impossibly, it was still alive. As I watched, its body began to change. The fur and scales seemed to melt away, revealing pale, human-like skin beneath. The limbs shortened, the claws retracted, and the face became almost human. I stared in horrified fascination as the transformation completed. Where the monster had been, there now lay an old man. His skin was wrinkled and weathered, his hair long and matted, and his eyes were open, filled with a mixture of pain and something that looked almost like gratitude. He opened his mouth, and in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in decades, he whispered, "Thank you." Then he closed his eyes, let out a long breath, and was still. I lay there, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. The creature, the Wendigo, had been human once, a man cursed or transformed into that thing, and I had freed him. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. Eventually I heard voices, felt hands lifting me onto a stretcher. The young ranger's face swam into view, her eyes wide with concern. "Mr. Renford, can you hear me? You're going to be okay." As they carried me out of the woods, I caught a glimpse of where the old man's body had been. But there was nothing there. No body, no blood, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. The next few weeks passed in a haze of hospital rooms and police interviews. My injuries were severe, multiple broken bones, deep lacerations, internal bleeding. The doctors called it a miracle that I had survived. The official story was that I had fallen while hiking in a restricted area of the park. There was no mention of the creature, no acknowledgement of the missing hikers. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. But I knew the truth, and so did the young ranger, whose name I learned was Lisa. She visited me in the hospital, her eyes haunted by what she had seen and heard that day in the woods. "What was that thing?" she asked in a whisper, glancing nervously at the door as if afraid someone might overhear. I sighed, wincing at the pain in my ribs. "It's called a Wendigo, an old legend come to life, a man transformed by an insatiable hunger." Lisa shook her head, disbelief warring with the evidence of her own eyes. "But how? Why?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe it was a curse. Maybe it was some kind of twisted evolution. All I know is that it's been out there for a long time, and I don't think it was the only one." Her eyes widened. "You mean there could be more?" I nodded grimly. "The legends speak of them in the plural, and the disappearances. They've been happening for too long, over too wide an area, for it to be just one creature." Lisa was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then she asked, "What do we do?" I looked at her, saw the determination in her eyes. She reminded me of myself all those years ago. Young, idealistic, ready to face the unknown. But I also saw the fear, the understanding of just how dangerous this knowledge could be. "We keep watch," I said finally. "We look for the signs, and we do what we can to protect people without letting them know what's really out there. Because if this got out, if people knew what was lurking in the woods, it would be chaos," Lisa finished. I nodded. "Exactly. Hunters would flood the forests looking for glory or profit. More people would die. And the Wendigos, they'd either be wiped out or driven deeper into hiding. Neither outcome helps anyone." Lisa nodded slowly, accepting the burden of this secret. "I'll do what I can," she promised. As she turned to leave, I called out, "Lisa, be careful. These things, they're patient. They can wait for years, decades even, for the right moment to strike. Don't ever let your guard down." She gave me a small, sad smile. "I won't. Take care, Mr. Renford." After she left, I lay back in my hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. I thought about the old man the Wendigo had become in its final moments. Who had he been? How long had he been trapped in that monstrous form? And most chillingly, how had he become that way in the first place? I was released from the hospital a few weeks later. The doctors called my recovery remarkable, but I knew I would never be the same. The scars, both physical and mental, would remain with me for the rest of my life. I couldn't go back to my old life. The thought of returning to those woods, of possibly encountering another Wendigo, filled me with a terror I couldn't overcome. But I couldn't simply walk away either. I owed it to Hank, to the hikers who had died, to do something. So I did the only thing I could think of. I started writing. Under a pseudonym, I began publishing articles about wilderness safety, about the dangers that lurked in the deep woods. I never mentioned the Wendigos directly, but I tried to give people the knowledge they needed to stay safe. I kept in touch with Lisa over the years. She remained at Acadia, keeping a vigilant eye out for any signs of Wendigo activity. Every so often, she would call me about a strange disappearance or an unusual animal sighting. Most of the time, it turned out to be nothing. But sometimes Sometimes I would feel that old familiar chill run down my spine. As the years passed, I began to hear stories from other parts of the country. A hiker in the Rockies describing a creature that sounded eerily familiar. A hunter in the Appalachians finding strange tracks and half-eaten carcasses. Each time I would pass the information along to Dr. Winters, who continued her research into these creatures. But for every story that reached my ears, I knew there were dozens more that went unreported. People who vanished without a trace, their fates known only to the dark and hungry things that roamed the wilderness. It's been over 30 years since that day in Acadia. I'm an old man now, my hair gray, my body bearing the scars of my encounter. But I can't forget. I won't forget. I've dedicated my life to studying these creatures, to understanding them as best I can. Dr. Winters and I have compiled a vast archive of sightings, encounters, and legends. We've mapped out their territories, tracked their movements as best we can, but for all our efforts, we've barely scratched the surface. The Wendigos remain a mystery, their origins unclear, their true nature elusive. Are they a natural phenomenon, some twisted offshoot of evolution? Or are they something more supernatural, the product of an ancient curse or forgotten ritual? We may never know the full truth, but what we do know is this: they're out there, waiting, watching, hungry. I've trained others over the years, people like Lisa, who have encountered these creatures and lived to tell the tale. We've formed a loose network of watchers, keeping an eye on the wild places of the world. We do what we can to protect people, to steer them away from danger without revealing the full extent of what lurks in the shadows. But it's not enough. It can never be enough. For every life we save, for every potential victim we warn away, there are others who fall prey to the Wendigo's insatiable hunger. And now, as I near the end of my life, I find myself facing a difficult decision. Do I take this knowledge, this terrible secret, to my grave? Or do I share it with the world? Consequences be damned. I've written this account, my full and true story, and sealed it away. Perhaps someday, when the world is ready, when we've advanced enough to face these creatures on equal terms, someone will find it. Perhaps then, the truth can come to light. But for now, the secret remains. The Wendigos continue to hunt in the deep woods, in the places where civilization's light doesn't quite reach. And we, the watchers, continue our vigil. To those who read this, I have one final warning. Be careful in the wild places of the world. Respect the wilderness, but never forget that it holds dangers beyond your imagining. And if you ever find yourself alone in the woods, hearing a strange, rattling cough echoing through the trees, run, and don't look back. For the hunger that drives the Wendigo is eternal, insatiable. And in the dark of the forest, in the shadows between the trees, it waits. Always waiting, always hungry. This happened in the 1980s, 1983 to be exact. When you're the kind of guy who spends most of his time walking the trails and making sure tourists don't get lost, you start to think you've seen it all. Weird hikers, wildlife that gets a little too close, and even the occasional illegal camper hiding out in the woods. My name's Frank Hawkins, and I've been a forest ranger at Redwood National Park since '75. I'm not some backwoods survivalist or anything, but I know how to handle myself out here. Or at least I thought I did. It was late September when things took a turn. I only remember the exact date because I'd just gotten back from a fishing trip with my older brother, and we'd spent the whole time making bets about who'd catch the biggest salmon. He's always been the outdoorsy one, not me. It's a joke in the family. They say, how does Frank get by watching trees grow all day? But I like it. Quiet job, less hassle. That particular day, September 28th, I was called in to do a routine check on the Tall Trees Trail. We'd had reports of a couple of hikers who hadn't come back to the visitor center when they were supposed to. Their friends said they were fine, probably just lost track of time. But I'd been around long enough to know that kind of confidence in the woods is what gets people in trouble. I remember the call like it was yesterday. It was just past noon and I was finishing up some paperwork in the ranger station when the phone rang. It was Judy, one of our dispatch operators. "Frank," she said, her voice tight with worry, "we've got a situation. 2 hikers, Mike Brennan and Tom Schultz, both in their mid-20s, haven't checked in. They were supposed to be back by 10 a.m. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already 12:30 p.m. A knot formed in my stomach. 2.5 hours wasn't a huge delay, but in these woods, every minute counted. "Any contact with them at all?" I asked, already reaching for my gear. "Nothing since yesterday evening," Judy replied. "Their campsite was registered near Tall Trees Grove. They were supposed to hike out this morning." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "All right, I'm on it. I'll head out to the trailhead and work my way in. Keep me posted if you hear anything." "Will do, Frank. Be careful out there." As I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way Judy's voice had wavered. Or maybe it was just instinct after years on the job. Whatever it was, it made me double-check my pack before heading out. I threw in extra water, some high-energy snacks, a first aid kit, and a heavy-duty flashlight. As an afterthought, I grabbed the old .38 revolver from the locked cabinet. We weren't supposed to carry firearms on routine checks, but something told me I might need it. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, just the usual winding roads through the towering redwoods. But as I parked the Ranger truck and stepped out, that feeling of unease grew stronger. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I radioed in to let Judy know I was starting my search, then set off down the trail. The Tall Trees Trail isn't particularly long, only about 3.5 miles round trip, but it winds through some of the densest, oldest parts of the forest. The redwoods here are ancient, some over 1,000 years old, their massive trunks disappearing into the canopy hundreds of feet above. Under normal circumstances, I love this trail. There's something awe-inspiring about walking among living things that have stood silent witness to centuries of history. But today the shadows seemed deeper, the silence more pronounced. About a mile in, I realized just how quiet it was. You get used to the sounds of nature after a while. Wind rustling the trees, birds chirping, squirrels rummaging through the underbrush. But this time it was dead silent, and not the peaceful kind of quiet either. It was the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. Now, I've dealt with mountain lions before, even saw a black bear once, but this didn't feel like either of those. Predators don't make everything else stop. They're just part of the landscape. Whatever it was, though, I kept going. Had a job to do, after all. As I pushed deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me. The trail, usually well-maintained, was overgrown in places, as if nature was trying to reclaim it. I found myself having to push through ferns and step over fallen branches more often than usual. That's when I spotted the first sign of trouble. About 2 miles in, just off the main trail, I found their campsite, or what was left of it. The tent was half collapsed, definitely not how experienced hikers would leave it. It was a good quality tent too, the kind serious backpackers use. But now it was a mess, the fabric torn in places. One of the poles snapped clean through. As I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right here. This wasn't just a case of campers leaving in a hurry. This looked like, well, I wasn't sure what it looked like, but it sent a chill down my spine. I moved closer, my hand instinctively going to the revolver on my hip. The campsite was a disaster. Scattered gear, some shredded clothes, and a couple of old food wrappers were strewn around like someone, or something, had torn through the place in a frenzy. "Mike, Tom," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest. No response. I knelt down to examine the ground around the tent. That's when I saw them. Footprints, but not human footprints. These were different, larger than any boot print I'd ever seen, with a strange elongated shape. 5 toes, but spread wide, almost like a hand. And the depth of the impressions, whatever made these, was heavy, much heavier than a person. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear, maybe? But bears don't have feet like this. And the pattern was all wrong. These prints didn't move like a 4-legged animal. They were spaced like something that walked on 2 legs, but with a gait much longer than any human's. I stood up, my eyes scanning the surrounding trees. Nothing moved. Not even a leaf stirred in the oppressive stillness. I keyed my radio, hoping to get through to Judy back at the station. Nothing but static. Coverage gets spotty out here, but usually we can at least get a weak signal. This silence was unusual, and it did nothing to calm my growing unease. Turning back to the campsite, I started to sift through the scattered gear, looking for any clue as to what might have happened. One of the backpacks was relatively intact. I opened it, finding a wallet inside. Mike Brennan, according to the driver's license. 26 years old, from San Francisco. An avid hiker, judging by the well-worn gear. The other pack was in worse shape, torn open down one side. Tom's, I assumed. His belongings were scattered around the clearing. Clothes, a map, a compass, some energy bars. But no sign of Tom himself. As I stood there trying to piece together what might have happened, a sound broke the silence. A crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. It came from deeper in the forest, off the trail. I spun around, my hand going to my revolver. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Ranger Hawkins. Is anyone there?" No response, just more silence. I debated my next move. Protocol said I should head back, report what I'd found, and wait for backup. But Mike and Tom had already been missing for hours. If they were hurt out there, waiting could mean the difference between life and death. Taking a deep breath, I made my decision. I'd continue on, following the strange footprints. But first, I needed to leave a message for any search parties that might come after me. I pulled out my notepad and pen, quickly scribbling down what I'd found and where I was heading. I tucked the note into a plastic bag to protect it from the elements, then wedged it securely in a crack in one of the massive redwood trunks near the campsite. With one last look around the destroyed campsite, I set off into the undergrowth, following those bizarre, unsettling footprints. The forest seemed to grow denser as I moved away from the established trail. The redwoods here were older, their massive trunks so wide it would take a dozen people linking hands to encircle them. The canopy far above blocked out most of the sunlight, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. I moved slowly, carefully, my eyes constantly scanning the ground for more of those strange footprints. They were there, leading me deeper into a part of the forest I'd never explored before. This was well off any marked trail, the kind of place even experienced hikers rarely ventured. The silence was broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. Every so often I'd stop and listen, straining my ears for any sign of the missing hikers. But there was nothing. No calls for help, no distant voices, just the oppressive silence of the ancient forest. As I pushed through a particularly thick patch of ferns, my foot caught on something. I looked down, expecting to see a root or fallen branch. Instead, I found myself staring at a backpack. Tom's backpack, judging by the torn side I'd seen back at the campsite. My heart rate picked up as I knelt to examine it. The pack was muddy and torn, as if it had been dragged through the underbrush. But what really caught my attention were the marks on the straps. Deep gouges like something with incredibly sharp claws had slashed through the tough nylon. I stood up slowly, my eyes darting around the clearing. That's when I saw it. About 20 feet away, half hidden by the base of a massive redwood, was a shoe. A hiking boot, to be precise. And inside it, I swallowed hard, fighting back a wave of nausea. Inside the boot was a human foot, severed cleanly at the ankle. For a moment, I just stood there, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not in my forest. But the evidence was right there in front of me, undeniable and horrifying. I forced myself to approach, my hand on my revolver. As I got closer, I could see dark stains on the leaves around the boot. Blood, a lot of it. "Oh God," I muttered, the words escaping me before I could stop them. I knelt down, examining the severed foot more closely. The cut was clean, almost surgical in its precision. No animal I knew of could do this, and those claw marks on the backpack. This was something else entirely. A twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, drawing my revolver in one smooth motion. My eyes scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. But I could feel it now, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I was being watched. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is Ranger Hawkins. If you can hear me, I'm here to help." Silence. Then, from somewhere to my left, a sound. a low, guttural growl unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion. It was something else. I turned slowly toward the sound, my revolver raised. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on my eyes. Was that a figure standing there or just my imagination? Another growl, closer this time, and with it, a smell. A horrific, overwhelming stench of decay and something else, something alien and wrong. My training kicked in, overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze me. I started to back away slowly, keeping my eyes on the spot where I'd heard the growl. Whatever was out there, I wasn't equipped to handle it alone. That's when I saw it, just for a moment as I was backing up. A flash of pale, almost translucent skin, a glimpse of a limb that was too long, too thin to be human, and eyes. God, those eyes, glowing in the shadows, fixed on me with an intelligence that sent ice through my veins. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but in that moment, every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. Behind me, I could hear it moving, not running, not crashing through the forest like I was. No, this was different. A smooth, sliding sound punctuated by the crack of breaking branches, like something was pulling itself through the trees with incredible speed. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every ounce of my being was focused on getting back to the trail, back to my truck, back to safety. As I ran, my mind raced. What was that thing? How long had it been out here? And Mike and Tom, God, were they all ready? I burst out of the undergrowth onto the main trail, nearly falling as I stumbled over a root. I caught myself on a tree trunk, my hand scraping against the rough bark. For a moment I paused, gasping for breath, listening. Silence. No sound of pursuit. Had I lost it? Or was it still out there, watching, waiting? I didn't want to find out. I turned and started jogging down the trail, back toward the trailhead. I needed to get back, to report what I'd found, to warn people about what was out here in these woods. As I ran, the shadows seemed to deepen around me. The massive redwoods, usually so comforting in their ancient majesty, now felt oppressive, like silent sentinels watching my desperate flight with indifference. I was about halfway back to the trailhead when I heard it again. That growl. Closer now, much closer. And this time, it was in front of me. I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Slowly, I raised my revolver, pointing it down the trail. There, in the shadows between two massive redwoods, something moved. Something big. I caught a glimpse of pale skin, of limbs too long and thin to be natural, and then it stepped out onto the trail. Now I've spent most of my adult life in these woods. I've seen things that would make most city folks run screaming, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that day. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, but hunched over like it was dragging itself along. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a frame that was all angles and sharp edges. Its limbs were too long for its body, ending in hands, if you could call them that, with fingers that curved inward, ending in wicked knife-like claws. But its face, God, its face. Where there should have been eyes, there were just deep, dark hollows. Its mouth was a gaping maw lined with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. For a moment we just stood there, staring at each other. Me with my pathetic little revolver that suddenly felt about as useful as a toy, and it studying me with those eyeless sockets, its head cocked to one side like a curious dog. Then it moved, faster than anything I've ever seen. One moment it was standing there, the next it was right in front of me, one long-fingered hand reaching for my face. I fired. The sound of the revolver was deafening in the quiet forest. The thing jerked back, a high-pitched shriek escaping its lipless mouth. Dark, viscous fluid oozed from a wound in its chest. I didn't wait to see if I'd hurt it badly. I turned and ran, harder than I've ever run in my life. Behind me I could hear it coming, that sliding, scraping sound as it pulled itself after me with terrifying speed. The trailhead seemed impossibly far away. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I could feel it right behind me, could smell that horrific stench of decay. And then suddenly I was out. The trees thinned, and I burst into the parking lot. My truck was there, right where I'd left it. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. As I yanked open the truck door, I risked a glance back. The thing was there, at the edge of the trees. It stood motionless, those empty eye sockets fixed on me. For a moment I thought it might come after me, might charge across the open parking lot. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching. And then slowly, it melted back into the shadows of the forest. I climbed into the truck, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I nearly cried with relief. I peeled out of that parking lot like the hounds of hell were after me. In a way, I guess they were. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur. My mind kept replaying what I'd seen, trying to make sense of it. But there was no making sense of that thing. It defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. When I pulled up to the station, Judy was waiting outside. The look on her face told me she knew something was wrong. "Frank, what happened out there?" she asked as I stumbled out of the truck. I must have looked a sight. My clothes were torn and dirty, my face scratched from branches, and my eyes, well, I can only imagine what she saw in my eyes. "We need to call in everyone," I said, my voice hoarse. "There's something out there, Judy, something not natural." She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But she knew me well enough to know I wouldn't say something like that lightly. "Come inside," she said, taking my arm. "You need to sit down and tell me everything." The next few hours were a whirlwind. I told my story to Judy, then to the park superintendent when he arrived, then to the local sheriff and his deputies. Each time I could see the disbelief in their eyes. Hell, I could hardly believe it myself. But the evidence was there. The destroyed campsite, the strange footprints, and God, that severed foot in the boot. We sent out search parties, of course, but I knew deep down that we wouldn't find Mike or Tom. Not alive, anyway. As night fell, more rangers arrived from neighboring districts. The park was closed to visitors, and we set up a command center in the main office. Maps were spread out on tables, areas marked off for systematic searches. I should have been out there, leading one of the search teams. But the superintendent had taken one look at me and ordered me to stay put. "You've been through enough, Frank," he'd said. "Let the others handle this." So I sat in the office answering questions, pointing out on the map where I'd seen it, where I'd found the campsite, the backpack, the boot. All the while my mind kept drifting back to those woods, to that thing standing at the edge of the trees, watching me drive away. It was well past midnight when one of the search teams radioed in. They'd found something, not Mike or Tom, but evidence. They wouldn't say more over the radio. When they brought it in, I understood why. It was a piece of that thing, a long, pale, almost translucent finger, ending in a wickedly sharp claw. It had been cut off cleanly, probably by my gunshot. The room fell silent as we all stared at it. It was undeniably real. Undeniably not human, not animal, not anything we could explain. "What the hell is this, Hawkins?" the sheriff asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know. I really don't know." The finger was bagged and sent off for analysis. Not that I expected any lab to be able to identify it. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't from any world of science I knew. As dawn broke, we were no closer to finding Mike and Tom. The search parties had combed miles of forest, finding nothing but more of those strange footprints. And in one area, deep in the woods, they'd found trees with deep claw marks, 8 feet off the ground. The official story, when it finally came down, was that the 2 hikers had been attacked by an animal. Probably a bear, they said. The strange footprints, just distorted by rain and time. The claw marks on the trees, an unusually large bear marking its territory, and that finger? Well, that was never mentioned in any official report. I knew better, of course. We all did, those of us who'd been there that night. But what could we say? That there was some kind of monster living in the Redwood National Park? That it had killed 2 hikers and nearly got a park ranger? No, the truth was too fantastic, too terrifying. So we kept quiet. The park reopened after a week. Tourists came back, hiking the same trails, camping in the same spots where Mike and Tom had disappeared. But things were different now, at least for those of us who knew. We went out in pairs, always armed. We warned hikers to be back before dark, to stay on the marked trails. And we watched, always watched. As for me, well, I stayed on as a ranger. Someone had to, someone who knew what was really out there. But I never went back to that part of the forest. Never hiked the tall trees trail again. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear it. That low, guttural growl. The sound of branches breaking as something large moves through the trees. But I tell myself it's just my imagination, just the wind in the redwoods or a far-off animal. But deep down I know the truth. I know that somewhere out there in the ancient towering redwoods, something waits, something watches, something that doesn't belong in this world, but is here all the same. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and the shadows grow long, I wonder, how long has it been here hiding in these woods? And more importantly, is it the only one? In the weeks that followed, a sort of uneasy normalcy settled over the park. On the surface, everything went back to business as usual. Tourists came and went, hikers explored the trails, and we rangers went about our daily routines. But underneath it all, there was a current of tension, a constant vigilance that hadn't been there before. The official investigation into Mike and Tom's disappearance continued, but it was clear from the start that it was more about going through the motions than actually finding answers. The local authorities, along with the Park Service, seemed determined to stick to their animal attack story, no matter how many holes we poked in it. I was called in for multiple interviews, each one more frustrating than the last. They wanted me to change my story, to say I'd seen a bear, or maybe a mountain lion. Anything but what I'd actually witnessed. "Come on, Frank," one of the investigators said during a particularly heated session. "You know as well as I do that there's no such thing as monsters. You were tired, it was getting dark, your mind played tricks on you." I stood up, slamming my hands on the table. "Damn it, Jim, I know what I saw. That thing wasn't any animal. And what about that finger? You can't tell me that came from any bear." Jim, a Park Service investigator I'd known for years, just shook his head. The finger was inconclusive. Could have been from any number of animals. Maybe a primate that escaped from a lab or a private collection. But there's no such thing as monsters, Frank. You need to accept that. But I couldn't accept it. None of us who'd been there that night could. We knew the truth, even if no one would believe us. As the official investigation wound down, a few of us decided to conduct our own, off the books. Me, Judy from Dispatch, and a couple of other rangers who'd been on the search teams. We'd meet after hours, poring over maps, comparing notes, trying to piece together what had really happened. We started by retracing my steps from that day. Judy and I hiked out to the Tall Trees Trail following the path I'd taken. The campsite had been cleared away, of course, any evidence long since bagged and tagged, but the forest itself seemed different now. The trees, once majestic and awe-inspiring, now felt oppressive. Every shadow held potential danger, every rustle of leaves a possible threat. We moved quietly, our eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. When we reached the spot where I'd found the severed foot, Judy gasped. "Oh my God, Frank," she whispered. Seeing it on a map is one thing, but being here..." I nodded, understanding completely. It was one thing to hear about it, to see photos. It was another to stand in that clearing, to see the dark stains still visible on the leaves and undergrowth. We pressed on, following the path I'd taken during my desperate flight. When we reached the spot where I'd first clearly seen the creature, we both stopped short. The trees here were different. Claw marks raked up their massive trunks, some so high up it made my neck hurt to look at them. And the undergrowth, it was like something had thrashed through it repeatedly, leaving a tangled mess of broken ferns and crushed plants. "What could do this, Frank?" Judy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's strong and big." We spent hours out there, taking photos, making notes. By the time we headed back, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. Neither of us wanted to be out there after dark. Over the next few weeks, we pieced together what we could. We tracked down every report of strange sightings or unexplained phenomena in the park going back years. Most were easily explainable. Lost hikers, overactive imaginations. But a few stood out. In 1976, a group of backpackers reported seeing a large, pale figure moving through the trees at night. They'd written it off as a trick of the moonlight. In 1979, a pair of researchers doing a bat survey recorded strange vocalizations that they couldn't identify. The recording had been lost, but their notes described it as a low, guttural growl, unlike any known animal in the region. And in 1981, just 2 years before my encounter, a solo hiker had gone missing on the very same trail where I'd found Mike and Tom's campsite. His body was never found. As we dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. The sightings, the strange occurrences, they all seemed to cluster around one particular area of the park. A remote, rarely visited section that included part of the Tall Trees Trail. "It's like it has a territory," Judy said one night as we pored over our maps. "It stays in this area for the most part, but why? What's special about this section of the forest?" I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my tired eyes. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's been here a long time, longer than we realized." Our unofficial investigation continued for months. We were careful, always operating under the radar. The last thing we needed was for the higher-ups to catch wind of what we were doing. But despite all our efforts, we were no closer to understanding what that thing was, or where it had come from. We had theories, of course. Everything from an undiscovered species to, well, to things that belonged more in science fiction than reality. The one thing we were sure of was that it was still out there. Every now and then we'd get reports. A hiker seeing something strange in the twilight. Unusual tracks found deep in the woods, and always in that same area. We did what we could to protect people without raising alarms. We'd routinely close trails for maintenance or wildlife activity. We beefed up our patrols in that section of the park. And we warned people, as much as we could without sounding crazy, to be careful, to stay on the trails, to be out of the woods before dark. For the most part, it worked. There were no more disappearances, no more encounters like the one I'd had, but we all knew it was just a matter of time. Sooner or later, that thing would make another appearance, and when it did, we needed to be ready. It was almost exactly a year after my encounter when it happened again. July 15th, 1984, a date that's burned into my memory as clearly as the day I first saw that thing in the woods. It started like any other summer day in the park. Tourists everywhere, the parking lots full, the trails busy with hikers. I was on my usual patrol, keeping an eye on things, making sure everyone was staying safe and following the rules. Around mid-afternoon, I got a call from Judy at dispatch. "Frank, we've got a situation," she said, her voice tense. "A family of hikers up on Lookout Point. They're reporting, well, you'd better hear it for yourself." She patched me through to a man whose voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand him. We saw something," he stammered. "Up in the trees, it was... God, I don't know what it was, but it was watching us, my wife, my kids. We need help, please." I felt my blood run cold. Lookout Point was in that area, that part of the forest where we'd tracked most of the strange occurrences. "Sir, I need you to stay calm," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "Are you and your family safe right now?" Yes," he replied. "We're at the lookout station. We ran here after we saw it. But please, you have to believe me. This wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was something else." "I believe you," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." I radioed Judy back. "Get a team together," I told her. "And Judy, make sure everyone's armed." The drive to Lookout Point was tense. I kept my eyes on the road, but every shadow in the trees seemed to move. Every branch looked like a clawed hand reaching out. When I arrived at the lookout station, I found the family huddled inside. The man who had called, his wife, and their 2 kids. A boy and a girl probably no older than 10. They all looked terrified. "I'm Ranger Hawkins," I said as I entered. "Are you all okay? Is anyone hurt?" The woman shook her head. "We're not hurt, just scared, very scared." I nodded, turning to the man. "Can you tell me exactly what you saw?" He took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. We were on the trail, heading back down. The kids were running ahead a bit. Then we heard this sound, like something big moving through the trees. His wife picked up the story. "We called the kids back to us. That's when we saw it, up in the trees, moving from one to another. It was huge, pale, like nothing I've ever seen before." The man nodded. It stopped in one of the big redwoods, just watched us. I swear I could feel it looking at us, even though I couldn't see any eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the same thing I'd seen a year ago. You did the right thing, I told them. Staying together, getting to safety. A team is on its way. We're going to get you out of here safely. Just then my radio crackled. It was Judy. Frank, the team's about 10 minutes out. How's it looking up there? I stepped outside to respond, my eyes scanning the trees. Family's shaken up, but okay, no sign of anything unusual. Yet, that's when I heard it. That low, guttural growl. The same sound I'd heard a year ago. The sound that haunted my nightmares. I spun around, my hand going to my revolver. There, at the edge of the clearing, a flash of pale skin, a glimpse of a long, thin limb. Judy, I said into the radio, my voice low and urgent. Tell the team to hurry, it's here. I backed up slowly towards the lookout station. Stay inside, I called to the family. Whatever happens, whatever you hear, stay inside. The thing moved then, emerging from the trees with that strange fluid motion. It was just as I remembered. Tall, pale, with those impossibly long limbs and claws that looked sharp enough to tear through steel. It stood there at the edge of the clearing, its eyeless face turned towards me. Was it the same one I'd encountered before? Had my bullet wounded it, or had it shrugged it off like it was nothing? For a long moment we just stared at each other. Me, with my revolver that suddenly felt woefully inadequate, and it, studying me, its head tilted to one side in that unsettlingly curious way. Then slowly it began to move towards me. I raised my revolver. Stop right there, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Don't come any closer. It paused, its head cocking to the other side. Did it understand me, or was it just reacting to the tone of my voice? I heard a whimper from inside the lookout station. The kids. God, the kids were watching this. The creature's head snapped toward the sound. Its lipless mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It took another step forward. I fired. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the quiet forest. The bullet hit the thing in the shoulder, causing it to stumble back. Dark, viscous fluid oozed from the wound. For a moment I thought that might be enough to drive it off. But then it straightened up, its mouth opening in a silent snarl. And it charged. I emptied my revolver, each shot finding its mark, but it was like shooting a tank with a pea shooter. The thing just kept coming. I turned to run, to lead it away from the family in the lookout station, but I wasn't fast enough. One of those long-fingered hands grabbed my shoulder, claws digging in deep. I yelled in pain as it yanked me back, spinning me around to face it. Up close, the creature was even more terrifying. Its skin was almost translucent, pulsing with an unnatural internal light. Where its eyes should have been, there were just deep, dark sockets, but somehow I knew it could see me, could see right through me. Its other hand came up, claws spread wide, ready to rake across my face. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. Then I heard it, the rumble of engines, shouts, gunshots. The creature's head snapped up, distracted by the new sounds. Its grip on my shoulder loosened just enough for me to wrench free. I stumbled backward, falling to the ground. More gunshots rang out. The creature let out a high-pitched shriek that made my ears hurt. It turned faster than anything that size should be able to move, and bolted for the trees. I saw Judy and 3 other rangers emerge from the trail, rifles raised. They fired after the fleeing creature, but it was already gone, vanishing into the shadows of the forest. Frank. Judy was at my side in an instant, helping me to my feet. Are you okay? Did it hurt you? I shook my head, wincing at the pain in my shoulder. I'm all right, it's just a scratch. The family. They're safe, one of the other rangers called out. He was at the door of the lookout station, talking to the shaken but unharmed family inside. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of what had just happened hit me. It was back, or maybe it had never left. And this time there were witnesses. A whole family had seen it. We need to get everyone out of here, I said, my voice hoarse. Now, before it comes back. Judy nodded, already on a radio calling for backup and medical support. The other rangers were helping the family out of the lookout station, keeping their rifles trained on the tree line. As we made our way back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that somewhere in those ancient redwoods, That thing was following us, waiting for another opportunity. The next few days were a blur of debriefings, medical exams, and heated arguments with park management. The family was adamant about what they'd seen, and this time there was no hiding it. Too many people had witnessed the event, had seen the creature. The park was closed indefinitely. Search teams were sent out, armed with heavy rifles and tranquilizer guns. Scientists and cryptozoologists descended on the area, eager to prove or disprove the existence of the creature. But despite all the manpower, all the technology, we found nothing. No trace of the creature. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. As for me, I was put on administrative leave. For your own good, they said. You need time to recover. But I knew the truth. They wanted me out of the way, wanted to control the narrative. But I couldn't let it go. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. And I knew it was still out there, somewhere in those woods. So I did the only thing I could do. I started talking to anyone who would listen. Journalists, researchers, anyone who was willing to hear the truth about what was lurking in Redwood National Park. Most people thought I was crazy, of course. A ranger who'd cracked under the pressure, seeing monsters in the woods. But a few listened, a few believed. And as the years went by, more stories came out. More sightings, more encounters. Always in the same area, always with the same description. Something tall, pale, with long limbs and no eyes. The official line remained the same. A bear, they said, or a mountain lion. People's imaginations running wild. But those of us who knew, who had seen it up close, we kept searching, kept watching, because we knew the truth. There was something out there in those woods, something that didn't belong in our world. And sooner or later, it would make its presence known again. As I sit here now, years later, looking out at those towering redwoods, I can't help but wonder, how long has it been here? What does it want? And most chillingly of all, is it alone? The forest keeps its secrets well, but sometimes late at night, when the fog rolls in and the shadows grow long, I swear I can hear it. That low, guttural growl, the sound of branches breaking as something large moves through the trees. And I know, deep in my bones, that it's still out there, watching, waiting. This is the truth of what happened in Redwood National Park in the summer of 1983. A truth that's been buried, dismissed, and denied, but a truth nonetheless. And if you ever find yourself in those woods, walking among those ancient giants, remember this story. Keep your eyes open, your ears alert, and whatever you do, don't stray from the path, because you never know what might be watching you from the shadows of the redwoods. The story of the creature in Redwood National Park didn't end with my retirement from the ranger service. In fact, in many ways, that was just the beginning. Over the years, reports continued to trickle in, hikers glimpsing something pale and unnaturally tall moving through the trees, campers hearing strange sounds in the night, too low and guttural to be any known animal, park rangers finding inexplicable claw marks high up on ancient redwoods. The official stance remained unchanged. Natural explanations were given for every incident. Unusual bear activity, territorial disputes between mountain lions, the overactive imaginations of city folk unused to the deep wilderness. But those of us who knew the truth kept watching, kept documenting. We formed a loose network of believers, former rangers, researchers, cryptozoology enthusiasts. We called ourselves the Redwood Watchers. In 1995, 12 years after my first encounter, we had our biggest break yet. A wildlife photographer setting up camera traps deep in the restricted area of the park captured something extraordinary. The image was blurry, taken at night but unmistakable to those of us who had seen the creature up close. That tall, pale form, those impossibly long limbs, the eyeless face turned towards the camera. The photo caused a brief media sensation. Bigfoot of the Redwoods, the tabloids called it. More serious news outlets debated the authenticity of the image. Experts were called in to analyze it, to prove or disprove its veracity. In the end, like all such incidents, it faded from public consciousness, written off as a clever hoax or a misidentified bear. But for us, it was vindication, proof that we weren't crazy, that what we had seen was real. The years rolled on. The sightings continued, always in that same area of the park. We theorized that it was the creature's territory, a place it felt safe. protected by the ancient redwoods that had stood silent witness to its presence for who knows how long. In 2010, I received a call from Judy, my old dispatch operator. She was retiring, moving out of state to be closer to her grandkids. But before she left, she wanted to meet. Said she had something important to show me. We met at a small diner just outside the park. Judy looked older, her hair gone gray, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. Without a word, she slid a file folder across the table to me. Inside was a collection of documents, old reports stretching back to the early days of the park. Sightings of a pale giant in the woods, unexplained disappearances, strange sounds recorded by early researchers. "I've been collecting these for years," Judy said, her voice low. "Anything I could find in the old archives that might be connected. Frank, this thing, whatever it is, it's been here a long time. A lot longer than we thought." I leafed through the documents, my heart racing. The earliest report was from 1882, not long after the area was first settled by European Americans. A logger's account of a white devil in the woods, towering above the men, watching them from the trees. "My God," I whispered. "Over 100 years," Judy nodded. "And those are just the written records. Who knows how long it was here before that? The local tribes, they have stories, legends, of a pale spirit that guards the ancient trees, that punishes those who disrespect the forest." We spent hours poring over the documents, piecing together a history that had been hidden, forgotten, or deliberately buried. A history of something inhuman living in the heart of the redwood forest. As I drove home that night, my mind was reeling. We had always assumed the creature was some kind of undiscovered animal species. But this suggested something else entirely, something older, something that had coexisted with humans for centuries, maybe even millennia. In the years since, I've continued my research. I've spoken with tribal elders, with old-timers whose families have lived in the area for generations. I've combed through historical records, folklore, even geological surveys of the area. And slowly, a picture has begun to emerge of an entity intrinsically tied to the redwood forest. Not an animal, not in any sense we understand, but something else. A guardian, perhaps, or a manifestation of the forest itself. The sightings continue to this day. Always fleeting, always just on the edge of proof. But those of us who have seen it, who have felt its presence, we know the truth. There is something out there in the redwoods, something ancient, something powerful, something that defies our understanding of the natural world. And as long as those ancient trees stand, as long as that primeval forest endures, it will be there, watching, waiting, protecting its domain in ways we may never fully comprehend. So if you ever find yourself in Redwood National Park, walking among those towering giants, remember this story. Listen to the whispers of the wind through the branches. Watch the shadows that move in ways shadows shouldn't. And know that you are not alone in that forest, that something is watching you. Something that was there long before us and will likely remain long after we're gone. This is the truth of the Redwood Watcher, a truth that spans centuries, that defies explanation, a truth that reminds us that there are still mysteries in this world, still wonders and terrors that exist beyond the edge of our understanding. And in the heart of the redwood forest, one of those mysteries still roams free. As I sit here now, an old man looking back on a lifetime of experiences, I can't help but feel a mix of awe and trepidation about what I've learned and witnessed. The creature of the redwoods has become more than just a personal encounter or a local legend. It's a testament to the enduring mysteries of our world. In recent years, as climate change and deforestation have become pressing issues, I found myself wondering about the fate of our enigmatic forest dweller. Will it adapt as its habitat changes, or is it as ancient and immutable as the redwoods themselves? I've shared my story with my grandchildren, watching their eyes widen with a mix of fear and wonder. I see in them the same curiosity that drove me all those years ago, the desire to understand the unknown. But I also see the skepticism of a new generation raised on technology and scientific explanations. "But Grandpa," my youngest granddaughter asked me once, "if it's real, why hasn't anyone caught it on a good camera? Everyone has phones now." I smiled at her question, remembering my own doubts and frustrations over the years. "Sometimes," I told her, "the most important things in this world can't be captured on camera. They have to be experienced, felt, understood in ways that go beyond just seeing. As I approach the end of my life, I find myself drawn back to the redwoods more and more. I walk the trails I once patrolled, my old bones creaking nearly as much as the ancient trees around me. And sometimes, in the deepening twilight, I think I catch a glimpse of something pale moving through the shadows. Is it real? Is it just my aging eyes playing tricks on me? Or is it the manifestation of a lifetime spent searching for something beyond our understanding? In the end, I've come to realize that the truth of the Redwood Watcher isn't about proving its existence to the world. It's about recognizing that there are still mysteries out there, still things that defy our explanations and categorizations. It's about maintaining a sense of wonder in a world that too often seems to have lost it. So as I wrap up this account, my final testimony to the strange and wonderful thing that changed my life all those years ago, I leave you with this. The next time you find yourself in a forest, any forest, take a moment to really listen, to really look, to open yourself up to the possibility that there's more to this world than what we can easily explain or understand. Because out there, in the shadows between the trees, in the whisper of wind through ancient branches, there just might be something watching, something that reminds us of how small we are and how much wonder still exists in the world. And whether you believe in the creature of the redwoods or not, I hope you never lose that sense of wonder, because in the end, that's what makes life truly worth living. This is Frank Hawkins, former ranger of Redwood National Park, signing off. Remember, the forests are alive in more ways than we know. Treat them with respect, with awe, and with the understanding that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. And who knows? Maybe someday, in some dark and quiet grove, you'll have your own encounter with the unknown. And when you do, remember this old ranger's tale, and know that you're not alone. This happened in the 1985. I always thought being a park ranger in a place like Michigan's Upper Peninsula was going to be easy. Wide open forests, freshwater lakes as far as the eye could see, and the isolation of the wilderness were exactly what I wanted. I never imagined that isolation could take on a darker meaning. My name is Ron Whitman, and I was 32 years old when my life changed forever. Before I landed this job as a park ranger, I had worked a desk for 5 years in a dull insurance office in Chicago. That was enough to make anyone crave fresh air and solitude. Moving up here felt like a permanent vacation at first. I'd grown up fishing with my dad on Lake Superior, so it seemed like a dream come true, trading paperwork for trail maintenance and visitor questions about where to spot bald eagles. The trouble started in September, around the time tourists usually began thinning out. That part of the year, it's mostly locals who still camp or hike the remote areas of the woods. I was assigned to check on a couple of trails that had reports of people hearing strange noises. Now it's not rare for animals to start making a bit of a racket as winter approaches. Elk, for example, can sound pretty eerie if you're not familiar with their bugle calls. The day I went out, it was just me and a thermos of lukewarm coffee doing a loop around a 10-mile trail near Dead Man's Creek. That area doesn't get much traffic, which was fine by me. I had a pair of binoculars strapped around my neck, a notebook, and my old beat-up radio that sometimes decided it was more for show than actual communication. I was alone out there, or so I thought. The air was crisp that morning, carrying the first hints of autumn. Leaves were just beginning to turn, splashing the canopy with hints of gold and red. As I started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet. Usually you'd hear the chatter of squirrels, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, or the occasional bird call. But that day, it was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. After all, I'd been out here countless times before without incident. But as I continued deeper into the woods, the silence seemed to press in around me, almost tangible in its intensity. I was about halfway through my hike when I saw the first sign that something was truly wrong. A shredded backpack was hanging from a tree branch, far too high for any normal animal to have placed it there. Black bears could climb, sure, but they don't exactly hang trophies. The pack was torn to shreds, its contents scattered on the forest floor below. I approached cautiously, my heart rate picking up. As I got closer, I could see dark stains on the fabric. Blood. My mouth went dry and I fumbled for my radio, hoping against hope for a clear signal. But all I got was a wall of static. Great, I muttered to myself. The one day I could use this thing, it craps out. I took out my notebook and jotted down what I was seeing, trying to keep my hand steady. The backpack was a standard hiking model, forest green with black straps, or at least what was left of the straps. They'd been shredded as if by enormous claws. I noted the location, the condition of the pack, and the approximate height at which it was hanging, easily 15 feet off the ground. As I was writing, a gust of wind rustled through the trees, and I swear I heard something that sounded like a low, guttural growl. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but saw nothing but the endless expanse of trees. Get a grip, Ron, I told myself, but my voice sounded thin and scared even to my own ears. I debated turning back right then and there. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of those woods, but I had a job to do, and I'd never forgiven myself if someone was hurt out here and I'd turned tail and run. So against my better judgment, I pressed on. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The temperature seemed to drop with each step I took, and I found myself zipping up my jacket against a chill that seemed to come from within as much as without. It was maybe another mile down the trail when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Pieces of fabric, torn clothes scattered along the ground like someone had run right out of them. I crouched down to examine them, holding my breath. The clothes weren't weathered. They hadn't been out here long. It was as if someone had just been ripped out of them and disappeared without a trace. I picked up a piece of what looked like it had once been a flannel shirt. The fabric was damp and sticky, and when I turned it over, I saw it was soaked through with blood. My stomach lurched, and I dropped the cloth, wiping my hand frantically on my pants. Maybe a bear did this, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. Bears, when they're hungry or feel threatened, can go after people. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. There were no bear tracks, just odd, deep impressions in the dirt, like something heavy but not human had passed through. I took out my notebook again, my hand shaking so badly I could barely write. I sketched out the strange tracks as best I could, noting their depth and the unusual pattern. They were roughly circular, about the size of dinner plates, with what looked like claw marks at the edges. Whatever had made these was big, far bigger than any animal native to these woods. As I was finishing my notes, I heard it, a low, almost rhythmic thumping, like something huge was moving through the woods, stepping in time. I stopped in my tracks, my heart doing a little dance of its own, trying to listen closer. The sound stopped too, and for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined it. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just too much coffee and not enough breakfast. But then it started again, this time faster, and I swear it was following me. I began to walk, then jog, realizing I was picking up the pace to match whatever it was. I know this sounds ridiculous, but the trees felt like they were closing in on me, branches brushing against my arms, pulling at my sleeves. Panic started to set in, and I turned sharply off the trail, figuring if I could get some distance, I'd at least feel less like I was being hunted. What I stumbled upon next stopped me cold. The ground ahead of me was dark, not from shadow, but from blood. It was pooled thickly in the underbrush, splattered up the trunks of trees. There were pieces of something. Someone, I realized with a sickening lurch of my stomach, spread out in a way that didn't seem possible. It wasn't just a body torn apart. It was disassembled. The limbs were bent back at unnatural angles, as if something had taken time to methodically separate them. I froze. Then I did the stupid thing. I tried the radio again. Nothing, not even static this time. There was no way I was going to take a closer look, but I couldn't just leave. My job, however insane it felt at the moment, was to report this kind of thing. Taking a few deep breaths, I forced myself to pull out my camera, snapping pictures with shaking hands. There wasn't going to be a lot of explaining to do. This scene spoke for itself. But that's when I heard it again. The thumping, closer now, and a low, slow-breathing sound. I don't know why I looked behind me. Maybe I hoped I'd see another ranger, someone human, walking toward me. Instead, I saw it. Standing half hidden by trees was something taller than any person had any right to be. Its arms were long, unnaturally so, nearly dragging along the ground. Its face, or what I could make of it, was obscured by a tangled mess of hair or fur. The smell hit me before I even registered the rest of its body. Rot, decay, and something metallic. It was hunched, but still towering, and its fingers ended in long, sharp claws, slick with something I didn't want to identify. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a wolf, paralyzed by fear. Then it moved and the spell was broken. I didn't wait. I took off, running in the direction I'd come, my feet pounding the earth harder than I ever thought I could manage. It was fast, though, too fast, and I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me. I didn't dare look back. Branches whipped against my face, my clothes snagged on thorn bushes, but I didn't care. I could feel my lungs burning, every step heavier than the last. If I could just make it to the trailhead, maybe I'd be able to call for help. Real help, not this piece of junk radio I was carrying around like some kind of sick joke. I broke through the tree line and stumbled out onto the gravel road where I'd left my truck. There wasn't a moment to waste. I slammed the door shut, fumbled the keys in the ignition, and peeled out of there like a man who had just seen his death staring back at him. When I reached the ranger station, I burst in and managed to blurt out what I'd seen. My supervisor, Carl, stared at me for a long moment before calmly standing up and grabbing the phone. He made a few calls while I sat there trying to piece together the mess that was my mind. 2 hours later, there were state troopers, search and rescue teams, and more people with serious-looking faces than I'd ever seen in my life. But here's the thing. They didn't find anything. Not a trace of blood, no dismembered body, not even the torn clothes I'd seen along the trail. They took my report, but you could see it in their eyes. They thought I'd lost it out there. I quit the next day. I know what I saw, and I wasn't about to go back out there and pretend it was some hallucination or figment of my imagination. I've been a lot of things in my life, but crazy isn't one of them. Carl called me about a week after I left, said he didn't blame me for quitting, but that some of the rangers had been hearing strange noises out near Dead Man's Creek again, said they'd found more things hanging from trees, items that didn't belong to any animals. I haven't been back to the Upper Peninsula since. As for whatever's out there, it's not my job to figure it out anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that rhythmic thumping in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if one day it'll find its way out of those woods and into the wider world. The weeks following my encounter in the woods were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I'd moved back to Chicago, thinking the bustle of the city would help me forget what I'd seen. But the memories haunted me, seeping into every aspect of my life. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the echo of that creature's breathing ringing in my ears. During the day, I'd find myself scanning crowds, half expecting to see that towering, inhuman figure looming over the sea of people. My family and friends tried to be supportive, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They'd nod and make sympathetic noises when I talked about what happened, but I knew they didn't believe me. How could they? It sounded insane, even to my own ears. I tried to move on, to forget. I got a job at another insurance company, thinking the mind-numbing monotony might help. But every time I closed my eyes, I was back in those woods, running for my life. It was about 3 months after I'd left the Upper Peninsula when the first letter arrived. It was postmarked from Marquette, Michigan, and I recognized Carl's handwriting immediately. My hands shook as I opened it, a part of me dreading what I might find inside. The letter was brief, but its contents chilled me to the bone. Carl wrote that there had been more incidents in the area where I'd had my encounter. Hikers had gone missing, only to be found days later in a state that defied explanation. He didn't go into details, but the implication was clear. Whatever I had seen that day was still out there, and it was getting bolder. I wanted to throw the letter away, to pretend I'd never received it. But I couldn't. The guilt I'd been carrying since that day in the woods came rushing back. If I'd stayed, if I'd tried harder to convince people of what I'd seen, could these new incidents have been prevented? Over the next few weeks, more letters came. Each one described new horrors, new disappearances. Carl was careful with his words, never outright saying he believed my story, but the subtext was clear. He was reaching out to me because he didn't know who else to turn to. The final straw came when he mentioned a name I recognized, Bill Hawkins. Bill had been a fellow ranger, a guy I'd shared beers with after long shifts. According to Carl's letter, Bill had gone out to investigate some strange noises near Dead Man's Creek and hadn't come back. They'd found his radio smashed to pieces and a trail of blood leading deep into the woods. That was when I knew I couldn't run anymore. Whatever was happening up there, I was involved whether I liked it or not. I had seen that thing. I had survived an encounter with it. Maybe, just maybe, that meant I could help stop it. I quit my job the next day and bought a ticket back to Michigan. As the plane took off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was flying towards my doom. But I also knew that if I didn't face this, it would haunt me for the rest of my life. Little did I know the horror I had experienced in those woods was just the beginning. What awaited me in the Upper Peninsula would test not just my courage, but my very sanity. The creature I had encountered was more than just a monster. It was a harbinger of something far darker, far more ancient than I could have ever imagined. As the plane descended towards Marquette County Airport, I steeled myself for what was to come. Whatever happened, I was determined to uncover the truth behind the terror in the woods, no matter the cost. The familiar scent of pine and lake water hit me as soon as I stepped off the plane. For a moment, I was transported back to happier times. Summers spent fishing with my dad, the excitement of my first day as a ranger. But the weight of why I was here quickly brought me back to reality. Carl was waiting for me at the airport, looking older and more haggard than I remembered. The lines on his face seemed deeper, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He gripped my hand tightly when we shook, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. "Thanks for coming, Ron," he said, his voice gruff. "I wasn't sure you would." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. As we drove towards the ranger station, Carl filled me in on what had been happening since I'd left. The disappearances had continued, growing more frequent and more bizarre. It wasn't just hikers anymore. Hunters, experienced outdoorsmen, even a couple of locals who'd lived in the area their whole lives had vanished without a trace. "We've had to close off large sections of the park," Carl explained, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "But it's not enough. Whatever this thing is, it's not staying contained." I listened in growing horror as he described the latest incidents. Animals found mutilated in ways that defied natural predators. Strange tracks, similar to what I'd seen, appearing in areas miles apart within the same day. And the noises, deep, resonant howls that echoed through the forests at night, setting every dog in a 5-mile radius to frenzied barking. We pulled up to the ranger station, and I was struck by how little it had changed. The same weathered wooden building, the same faded signs warning about fire danger and bear safety. It felt surreal, like stepping into a time warp where everything looked the same but felt fundamentally wrong. Inside, Carl introduced me to the team he'd assembled. There was Dr. Lin Chen, a wildlife biologist brought in to study the unusual animal behavior in the area. Next to her stood Frank Delgado, a local hunter and tracker with decades of experience in these woods. And finally, Susan Harper, a paranormal investigator whose presence made me raise an eyebrow at Carl. "I know what you're thinking," Carl said, noticing my expression. "But at this point, we're not ruling anything out." Over the next few hours, we pored over maps, incident reports, and blurry photographs. The picture that emerged was terrifying in its implications. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't just a single creature. The pattern of sightings and incidents suggested multiple entities, working with an intelligence and purpose that sent chills down my spine. Dr. Chen pointed out areas where the local wildlife had drastically changed their behavior. "It's as if they're being driven out," she explained, her finger tracing a path across the map. "We're seeing species turn up in areas they've never inhabited before, all fleeing from this central region." Frank Delgado grunted in agreement. "Been hunting these woods for nigh on 40 years, he said, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. "Never seen anything like it. It's like the whole forest is scared." Susan Harper had been quiet up until this point, but now she leaned forward, her eyes intense. Have you considered the possibility that what we're dealing with isn't entirely physical? She asked. I felt a chill run down my spine at her words. Part of me wanted to dismiss her theory outright. Surely there had to be a rational explanation for all this. But then I remembered the creature I'd seen, its impossible proportions, the way it moved. Was it really so far-fetched to consider that we might be dealing with something beyond our understanding? Carl cleared his throat, bringing us back to the matter at hand. Whatever we're dealing with, physical or not, we need to find a way to stop it. Ron, you're the only one who's seen this thing up close and lived to tell about it. We need you to guide us back to where you had your encounter. I felt my mouth go dry at the thought of going back into those woods, but I knew I didn't have a choice. I nodded, trying to keep the fear out of my voice as I spoke. When do we leave? First light tomorrow, Carl replied. Get some rest. You're going to need it. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed of the ranger station's guest quarters, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature. Its long arms reaching for me, its breath hot on the back of my neck. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with dark forests and unseen terrors lurking just out of sight. Morning came too soon, the pale light of dawn filtering through the window. We gathered our gear in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we piled into the ranger vehicles, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading towards something that would change us all forever. The drive to the trailhead was tense, the usual banter and jokes that typically preceded a mission notably absent. As we approached Dead Man's Creek, the forest seemed to press in around us, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. We parked and gathered our gear. Carl distributed radios, top-of-the-line models that he assured us would work even in the densest parts of the forest. I couldn't help but remember my useless radio from that day, and hoped desperately that these would prove more reliable. As we started down the trail, I felt a sense of déjà vu so strong it nearly stopped me in my tracks. Everything looked the same as it had that day. The pattern of sunlight filtering through the leaves, the subtle bend in the path ahead. For a moment, I was gripped by the irrational fear that I had somehow been transported back in time, doomed to relive that terrifying encounter. But then Frank brushed past me, his rifle at the ready, and the spell was broken. This was different. This time I wasn't alone. We hiked in silence for the first hour, everyone on high alert. Even the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual chorus of birdsong and insect buzz noticeably absent. It was as if the whole woods were holding its breath, waiting. It was Dr. Chen who noticed it first, a strange, sweet smell that seemed to hang in the air. "Do you smell that?" she asked, her nose wrinkling in disgust. I did. It was faint at first, but growing stronger with each step we took. It reminded me of rotting fruit, cloying and sickly sweet. As we pressed on, the odor intensified, becoming almost unbearable. Then we saw it. Hanging from a tree branch, just like I remembered, was a backpack. But this one wasn't torn or bloodied. Instead, it was covered in a strange, glistening substance that seemed to pulse and move in the dappled sunlight. Susan stepped forward, her hand outstretched as if to touch it. "Don't!" I yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. As if in response to my shout, the substance on the backpack quivered and began to drip down onto the forest floor. Where it landed, the undergrowth withered and blackened, as if touched by acid. We all took an involuntary step back, watching in horror as the substance continued to eat away at the forest floor. "What the hell is that?" Frank muttered, his rifle raised as if he could shoot the strange ooze. Before anyone could respond, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees. It was a sound I recognized, one that had haunted my nightmares for months. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, to see a pair of glowing eyes watching us from the shadows. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Then louder as the creature began to move towards us. "Run!" We scattered, the sound of our panicked flight echoing through the unnaturally silent forest. I could hear it behind us, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Trees creaked and snapped as it plowed through them, gaining on us with terrifying speed. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was even more horrifying than I remembered. In the daylight, I could see details that had been mercifully obscured during our first encounter. Its skin was a patchwork of fur and scales, oozing the same viscous substance we'd seen on the backpack. Its face was a nightmare of mismatched features, as if someone had tried to create a human face from half-remembered descriptions. As I watched, unable to tear my eyes away, a part of its shoulder seemed to ripple and shift, sprouting a new limb even as it ran. This wasn't just a monster. It was something mutable, ever-changing, defying the very laws of nature with every movement. I turned back, pumping my legs harder, desperate to put more distance between myself and that abomination. But I knew, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that we couldn't outrun it forever. Sooner or later, we would have to stand and fight. As we crashed through the underbrush, I caught glimpses of the others. Carl was to my left, his face a mask of determination. Dr. Chen was ahead, her pack bouncing against her back as she ran. I couldn't see Frank or Susan, and I prayed they had managed to find a different path, one that led away from this horror. Suddenly, the ground dropped away beneath my feet. I tumbled down a steep embankment, leaves and branches whipping past my face. I landed hard at the bottom, the breath knocked out of me. As I lay there, gasping for air, I realized I couldn't hear the creature's pursuit anymore. Slowly, painfully, I sat up and looked around. I was in a small clearing, surrounded by dense undergrowth. There was no sign of the others, or of the monster that had been chasing us. The silence was absolute, pressing in on me from all sides. For a moment I allowed myself to hope that perhaps we had lost it, that maybe it had given up the chase. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the clearing, was a stone structure. It was ancient, covered in moss and vines, but unmistakably man-made. In all my years as a ranger, I had never seen or heard of any ruins in this part of the forest. As I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I noticed strange symbols carved into the stone. They seemed to writhe and shift as I looked at them, making my head spin. I knew I should try to find the others, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something drew me towards the structure, a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. As I approached, I could hear a faint whisper, like voices speaking in a language I almost recognized. With a trembling hand, I reached out to touch one of the symbols. As my fingers made contact with the cold stone, a jolt of energy surged through me. Suddenly, I understood. This wasn't just some random ruins in the woods. This was a doorway, a portal to somewhere else. And we had just unlocked it. As my hand touched the ancient stone, the world around me seemed to flicker and distort. For a brief, terrifying moment, I saw something. A vast, impossible landscape stretching out before me, filled with structures that defied geometry and creatures that hurt my mind to look upon. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vision vanished, leaving me gasping and disoriented. I stumbled back from the stone structure, my heart pounding in my chest. What had I just seen? More importantly, what had I just done? The air around the ruins seemed to shimmer and warp, like heat rising from hot asphalt. But this was no trick of the light or the summer heat. This was something else entirely. A low, resonant hum began to emanate from the structure, growing in intensity with each passing second. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I could feel the vibration in my bones. Panic gripped me as I realized the magnitude of what was happening. Whatever this doorway led to, it was opening, and I had been the one to turn the key. I turned to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if my feet had become rooted to the spot. The humming grew louder, drowning out everything else. In the distance I heard a sound that might have been someone calling my name, but it was faint and distorted, like a voice heard underwater. The air in front of the structure began to ripple and tear, revealing glimpses of that alien landscape I had seen in my vision. Tentacles of darkness reached out from the growing rift, grasping at the air around them, and then, emerging from the tear in reality, came the creature. It was the same beast that had been chasing us, and yet it was different. It seemed larger now, more defined, as if passing through the portal had solidified its form. Its eyes, glowing with an inner light, fixed on me with terrifying intelligence. As it fully emerged from the rift, I felt the paralysis that had gripped me release. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or stealth. Behind me, I could hear the creature's heavy footfalls and the sound of trees splintering as it gave chase. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish flight through the forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but still I pushed on, driven by a primal fear that overrode all else. Suddenly I burst out of the tree line and found myself back on the main trail. To my left I saw Carl and Dr. Chen, both looking as battered and terrified as I felt. To my right Frank emerged from the woods, his rifle at the ready. "Where's Susan?" I gasped out between ragged breaths. The grim looks on their faces told me all I needed to know. Whatever had happened while we were separated, Susan hadn't made it. There was no time to mourn. The sound of the creature's approach was growing louder. "We need to get out of here," Carl said, his voice shaking. "Back to the vehicles, now." We ran again, this time with a clear destination in mind. But as we rounded a bend in the trail, we saw something that made us all skid to a halt. The path ahead was wrong. The trees on either side seemed to bend and twist, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. The ground itself appeared to undulate, as if it were breathing. "What the hell?" Frank muttered, raising his rifle. Dr. Chen shook her head, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and scientific fascination. "It's spreading," she said. "Whatever that thing is, whatever realm it comes from, it's changing our world to match its own." The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a monster in the woods anymore. This was an invasion, a fundamental rewriting of reality itself. As if to confirm my thoughts, a chorus of inhuman howls rose from the forest around us. Not just one creature now, but many. The portal I had inadvertently opened had allowed more of these things through, and they were reshaping our world to suit them. "We can't outrun them," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "And we can't fight them, not like this." Carl nodded grimly. "We need to seal that portal. It's the only way to stop this from spreading further." "And how exactly do we do that?" Frank demanded, his eyes darting around, tracking the sounds of approaching creatures. "The symbols," I said, the memory of my brief contact with the stone structure flooding back. "They're the key, if we can figure out how to reverse the process." Dr. Chen was already digging through her pack. She pulled out a notebook and a pencil. "Describe them to me," she said. "Every detail you can remember." As I began to recount what I had seen, trying to recreate the twisting alien symbols from memory, the others formed a protective circle around us. The sounds of the creatures were getting closer, their howls now interspersed with the crack of breaking wood and the wet, meaty sounds of something large moving through the underbrush. Time seemed to stretch as I described the symbols, and Dr. Chen sketched furiously. Each moment felt like an eternity, the tension building until I felt like I might snap from the strain. Finally, Dr. Chen held up her notebook. The page was covered in a complex array of symbols, familiar yet utterly alien. "I think this might work," she said, "but we need to get back to that structure." The look we all shared was one of grim determination. We knew the odds were against us, that we might not all make it back. But we also knew that if we didn't try, everything and everyone we cared about would be consumed by this otherworldly invasion. "All right," Carl said, chambering around in his shotgun. "Let's finish this." As we turned to head back into the twisted, nightmare version of the forest we once knew, I couldn't help but think about how much had changed in just a few short hours. This morning, we had entered these woods as investigators, seeking answers to a mystery. Now we were all that stood between our world and utter annihilation. The forest ahead of us writhed and pulsed with unnatural life. Strange, phosphorescent growths clung to the trees, casting an eerie glow over everything. The very air seemed thick and syrupy, making each breath a struggle. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, acutely aware of the sounds of pursuit all around us. More than once we caught glimpses of twisted shapes moving through the undergrowth, always just at the edge of our vision. As we neared the clearing with the stone structure, the changes in the environment became even more pronounced. The trees here were no longer recognizable as any earthly species. Their bark was a shifting, iridescent texture that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Strange fruits hung from their branches, pulsing with an inner light. The clearing itself was barely recognizable. The ground was covered in a thick, spongy growth that squelched unpleasantly underfoot. The air was filled with spores or seeds of some kind, glowing particles that drifted lazily on unseen currents. And there, in the center of it all, was the stone structure. It was no longer covered in moss and vines. Instead, it gleamed as if newly carved, the alien symbols on its surface glowing with an inner light. The rift it had opened was larger now, a tear in the very fabric of reality that showed glimpses of that impossible other world. As we approached, we could see shapes moving on the other side, vast and terrible things that our minds struggled to comprehend. I felt a pressure building in my head, a pain that grew with each step we took towards the portal. "We need to hurry," Dr. Chen said, her voice tight with strain. "I don't think our minds can take much more of this exposure." She approached the structure, her notebook clutched tightly in her hand. As she began to trace the symbols she had drawn, mirroring their positions on the stone, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A roar, closer than any we had heard before, followed by the sound of something massive charging through the twisted forest towards us. "Keep going," Carl shouted, raising his shotgun. "We'll hold them off." Frank took up position next to Carl, his rifle at the ready. I stood there for a moment, torn between helping them and assisting Dr. Chen. In the end, I moved to stand beside her, ready to take over if something happened to her. The next few minutes were a blur of terror and desperate action, as Dr. Chen worked to reverse the symbols, tracing each one with painstaking precision. The rest of us fought a desperate battle against the encroaching horrors. The first creature burst into the clearing with a bone-chilling shriek. It was similar to the one I'd encountered before, but even more twisted and alien. Its body seemed to be in a constant state of flux, limbs sprouting and retracting, its flesh rippling with unnatural colors. Carl's shotgun roared, the blast catching the creature full in what passed for its chest. The thing staggered back, green ichor spraying from the wound, but it didn't fall. Instead, the injury seemed to close almost instantly, the flesh knitting back together before our eyes. Frank opened fire with his rifle, the sharp cracks a stark contrast to the otherworldly sounds filling the air. His shots were precise, targeting what looked like vital areas, but they seemed to have little lasting effect on the creature. More of them were emerging from the twisted forest now, each more horrifying than the last. Some moved on too many legs, while others slithered across the ground, leaving trails of corrosive slime. The air was filled with their howls and shrieks, a cacophony that threatened to drive us mad. I stood by Dr. Chen, my eyes darting between her work and the battle raging around us. My hand shook as I clutched my own weapon, a standard-issue Ranger's sidearm that seemed woefully inadequate against these monstrosities. "Almost done," Dr. Chen muttered, her voice strained with concentration. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and I could see her hands trembling as she traced the final symbols. A scream of pain cut through the chaos. I turned to see Frank on the ground, one of the creatures looming over him. Its jaw had unhinged, revealing rows upon rows of needle-like teeth. Without thinking, I raised my gun and fired, emptying the clip into the thing's head. To my shock, it worked. The creature's head exploded in a spray of that strange green ichor, and it collapsed, its body already beginning to dissolve into a puddle of bubbling goo. "The portal!" Carl shouted, his voice hoarse. "Something's changed!" I whirled back to the stone structure. The rift was pulsing now, expanding and contracting rapidly. The creatures seemed to sense the change too. They redoubled their efforts to reach us, their howls taking on a desperate edge. "It's done!" Dr. Chen cried, stumbling back from the structure. As the last symbol flared to life, a shockwave of energy burst from the portal, knocking us all off our feet. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in perfect stillness. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, the rift began to collapse in on itself. The creatures shrieked in what sounded like fear and rage, their bodies drawn inexorably towards the closing portal. We watched in awe and terror as the monstrosities were pulled back through the rift, their forms stretching and distorting as they disappeared into that other world. Trees, warped by the alien influence, uprooted themselves and followed, drawn by some unseen force. The air was filled with a maelstrom of debris, all of it being sucked into the collapsing portal. We clung to whatever we could, fighting against the pull ourselves. I could feel my grip slipping, the force threatening to tear me away. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, it stopped. The portal snapped shut with a thunderclap that shook the earth, and then silence. We lay there for what felt like hours, gasping for breath, unable to believe what we had just witnessed. Slowly, cautiously, we began to take stock of our surroundings. The clearing was devastated. The strange growths and alien vegetation were gone, leaving behind scorched earth and fallen trees. The stone structure stood silent and inert, the glowing symbols now dark and lifeless. Frank was badly injured, deep gashes across his chest and arm where the creature had gotten him. Carl looked like he had aged years in the span of hours, his face gaunt and his eyes haunted. Dr. Chen sat slumped against a tree, her notebook clutched to her chest, her eyes closed in exhaustion. As for me, I felt empty. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a sense of unreality. Had all of this really happened? But as I looked around at my battered companions in the devastated clearing, I knew it had. We had faced something beyond our comprehension, and against all odds we had survived. Carl was the first to speak, his voice rough. "We need to get out of here. Report this to someone." "Who?" I asked. "Who would believe us?" He shook his head. "I don't know, but we can't just pretend this didn't happen. Whatever that was, wherever it came from, it could happen again." We gathered ourselves as best we could, helping Frank to his feet. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look at the stone structure. It looked innocuous now, just an ancient ruin in the woods. But I knew better. I knew the danger it represented. "We should destroy it," I said. The others looked at me, then back at the structure. After a moment, Carl nodded. "You're right. We can't risk anyone else stumbling across this thing." It took us the better part of an hour to demolish the structure, using whatever tools we had at hand. When we were done, nothing remained but a pile of rubble. It wasn't much, but it felt like a victory, however small. As we made our way back through the forest, I couldn't help but notice how ordinary everything looked now. The trees were just trees again, the underbrush no longer writhing with alien life. But the memory of what we had seen, what we had fought, would stay with us forever. We emerged from the woods as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. The ranger station looked surreal in its normalcy, a bastion of the ordinary world we had left behind just hours ago. As we approached, I saw Susan standing on the porch, her face a mask of concern. She rushed towards us as we got closer. "Where have you been? I've been trying to radio you for hours." We all stopped, staring at her in disbelief. "Susan?" Carl said, his voice shaking. "But we thought—" She looked confused. "What are you talking about? I've been here the whole time. You all went into the woods this morning and then— nothing. No radio contact, no sign of you." I exchanged glances with the others. The implications of what Susan was saying were staggering. Somehow, in sealing the portal, we had altered reality. Or perhaps we had returned to our own reality, leaving behind the nightmare world we had experienced. As we stood there, grappling with this new revelation, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. We had survived, yes, but now we faced a new challenge. How could we explain what had happened? How could we convince anyone of the danger that still lurked in those woods? And more importantly, how could we be sure it was really over? The days following our return from the woods were a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and sleepless nights. We were all placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into the incident, as it was being called. The official story, as far as I could gather, was that we had encountered some kind of toxic substance in the woods, leading to mass hallucinations and erratic behavior. Our injuries were attributed to panic-induced accidents as we fled from imagined threats. It was a neat, tidy explanation that neatly swept the truth under the rug. But for those of us who had been there, who had seen and fought against those otherworldly horrors, it was a bitter pill to swallow. We were kept separated for the most part, our interactions closely monitored. I suspected they were looking for inconsistencies in our stories, trying to poke holes in the impossible tale we all insisted was true. It was during one of these debriefing sessions that I first met Agent Karen Reeves. She was different from the other investigators we'd dealt with so far. There was a sharpness to her gaze, a way she had of listening that made me think she wasn't just humoring us. "Mr. Whitman," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "I'd like to go over your statement one more time, if you don't mind." I sighed, rubbing my eyes tiredly. With all due respect, Agent Reeves, I've been over this a dozen times already. What makes you think this time will be any different? She leaned forward, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. Because this time, Mr. Whitman, I'm going to ask you to tell me what really happened out there. No filters, no worrying about how it sounds. Just the truth as you experienced it. I stared at her, trying to gauge her sincerity. After a moment, I nodded slowly. All right, but I warn you, it's not a pretty story. For the next several hours I talked. I told her everything, from my first encounter in the woods months ago to the final desperate battle at the portal. I described the creatures in vivid, horrifying detail, the way reality itself had seemed to warp and change around us, the terror and the desperation we had felt. Through it all, Agent Reeves listened without interruption, her face impassive. When I finally finished, my throat raw from talking, she sat back in her chair, her eyes distant. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman," she said after a long moment. "I know that couldn't have been easy to relive." "You believe me?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. She met my gaze steadily. "Let's just say that your account aligns with certain other incidents we've been investigating. I can't say more than that, but I want you to know that your experience, horrific as it was, may help prevent something even worse from happening." As she stood to leave, she paused at the door. "One more thing, Mr. Whitman. This conversation never happened. As far as anyone else is concerned, I asked you the same questions as every other investigator, and you gave the same answers. Understood?" I nodded, a mix of relief and new anxiety washing over me. As the door closed behind her, I sat there, trying to process what had just happened. Someone believed us. Someone in a position of authority knew that what we had experienced was real. But that knowledge brought with it a new set of questions. What other incidents had she been referring to? How long had the government known about these otherworldly incursions? And most importantly, what were they doing about it? Over the next few weeks, life slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy. We were all cleared to return to work, though I noticed that our assignments kept us far away from the area where we had encountered the portal. Carl retired soon after, citing health reasons. Frank transferred to a different district, unable to face the memories that these woods now held. Dr. Chen threw herself into her research with a fervor that bordered on obsession, though I noticed her publications now focused on more mundane aspects of forest ecology. As for me, I stayed. Someone had to, I reasoned. Someone had to keep watch, to be ready if anything like that ever happened again. But the woods were quiet now, almost too quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. It was on a crisp autumn day, almost a year after the incident, that I found myself back on that trail near Dead Man's Creek. I hadn't planned to come this way, but my feet had carried me here almost of their own accord. The clearing where the stone structure had stood was overgrown now, nature reclaiming the scarred earth. But as I stood there, memories flooding back, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, half hidden by new growth, was a single stone, and carved into its surface was a symbol I recognized all too well. As I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized that our victory had been temporary at best. We had closed one door, but there were others out there, and sooner or later something would find its way through. I pulled out my radio, my hand shaking slightly as I keyed the mic. "This is Ranger Whitman," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm going to need to speak with Agent Reeves. Tell her it's starting again." As I waited for a response, I kept my eyes fixed on that stone, half expecting it to flare to life at any moment. The forest around me was silent, but I could feel a tension in the air, a sense of anticipation. Whatever was coming, whatever battles lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. This time, we would be ready. It's strange how memories can lie dormant for years, only to surface with crystal clarity when something triggers them. I'm writing this account now, in 2024, but the events I'm about to describe took place in 2015, when I was 17. Sometimes I wonder if I should share this story at all, if by putting these words to paper I might somehow summon back the thing that haunted us. but the weight of keeping this secret has become too heavy to bear alone. Our family's move to Michigan hadn't been planned. My father's company had undergone a sudden restructuring, and we found ourselves transplanted from suburban Connecticut to the rural Midwest with barely 2 months' notice. The house we ended up buying was at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, backing up against dense woods that stretched for miles. Across the street, a vast cow pasture rolled toward the horizon, creating an illusion of isolation despite the neighboring houses on either side. I remember the day we first viewed the property. It was early March, and patches of dirty snow still clung to the shadows beneath the trees. The real estate agent, a nervous woman who kept checking her phone, seemed eager to close the deal quickly. Now I wonder if she knew something, if there was a reason the previous owners had left so abruptly, leaving behind pieces of furniture and personal items as if they'd fled in a hurry. The house itself was nothing remarkable at first glance. A 2-story colonial built in the late 1990s, painted a subdued sage green with white trim. But there was something about it that caught your eye and held it, like a sentence that seems normal until you read it twice. The windows were slightly too large for the facade, creating an unsettling effect that you couldn't quite put your finger on. The front door was solid oak, carved with an intricate pattern that our father said was typical Victorian decoration, but which I later realized formed abstract shapes that seemed to shift when viewed too long. From the day we moved in, something felt wrong. Not in any way I could articulate at first, just a persistent unease that seemed to hover at the edges of my consciousness. The air inside the house was always too still, as if it were holding its breath. Sounds behaved strangely. Conversations in one room would carry perfectly to another, while shouts from right next door would be muffled beyond recognition. My younger sister Madeline, who was 14 at the time, felt it too. She would sometimes stop mid-sentence while we were unpacking, cocking her head as if listening to something just beyond the range of human hearing. Our parents dismissed our concerns, attributing them to the natural adjustment period of moving to a new home. Mother threw herself into redecorating as if enough fresh paint and new curtains could mask the fundamental wrongness of the place. Father spent long hours in his new home office, the door firmly closed, on endless conference calls that seemed to echo oddly through the heating vents. I chose a bedroom on the second floor, overlooking the backyard and the woods beyond. The previous owners had painted it a pale blue that reminded me of winter skies, and something about the color seemed to repel the shadows that gathered so thickly in other parts of the house. I remember standing at my window that first evening, watching the sun set through the tree line. The shadows seemed to move differently here, stretching and contracting in ways that defied the normal physics of light. The trees themselves appeared to shift position when viewed from different windows, though I told myself this was just a trick of perspective. That first night, none of us slept well. The house made unfamiliar sounds, not the normal creaks and groans of a structure settling, but something more deliberate. It sounded almost like conversation, conducted in whispers just below the threshold of comprehension. When I mentioned this at breakfast the next morning, Mother laughed nervously and said all houses had their quirks. But I noticed she'd already begun pricing sound-dampening insulation, and Father had installed new locks on all the interior doors. The initial months in the house followed a pattern that would become familiar, periods of relative normalcy, punctuated by increasingly bizarre occurrences. Looking back, I realize now that the entity, I've taken to calling it that, though the term feels inadequate, was testing us, learning our routines, our fears, our breaking points. It started slowly, almost playfully, like a predator toying with its prey. The first truly inexplicable event occurred 3 weeks after we moved in. I had developed a habit of arranging my textbooks on my desk in precise order each night, a small ritual that helped me maintain some sense of control in our new environment. One morning in late March, I woke to find them perfectly stacked in the corner furthest from my bed, their spines facing the wall. When I mentioned this to my mother, she suggested I must have moved them while studying late, but I knew I hadn't. More disturbing was the fact that the dust on my desk showed no trails or marks indicating how the books had been moved. Similar incidents began occurring throughout the house with increasing frequency. Mother's carefully arranged kitchen implements would be found in different drawers. Father's important documents would vanish from his locked office, only to reappear days later in the basement, unmarked but smelling faintly of damp earth. Madeline's dolls, which she'd stopped playing with years ago but kept displayed on a shelf, would be found in different poses each morning, their heads invariably turned to face the woods behind our house. The local wildlife's behavior became increasingly erratic. The neighbors' dogs, 3 well-trained German shepherds, would often gather at the edge of their yards, staring intently into the woods behind our house. Their behavior was unsettling, not just for its consistency, but for their complete silence. These dogs, normally vocal at the slightest provocation, would stand rigid and silent for hours, their hackles raised, tracking something we couldn't see with their eyes. The cows in the pasture across the street exhibited even stranger behavior. They would sometimes bunch together in tight groups, facing outward in defensive circles against some unseen threat. The farmer, Mr. Henderson, seemed puzzled by their behavior but attributed it to coyotes or wolves in the area. But I'd seen enough National Geographic documentaries to know that prey animals don't behave that way around normal predators. They were reacting to something else, something that triggered a more primitive fear. Cold spots became a regular feature of our daily lives. They would appear without warning, patches of air so frigid they would cause your breath to mist even on warm days. These weren't the normal drafts you'd expect in an older home. They moved. I once tracked one as it traveled slowly up the main staircase, the temperature dropping by at least 20 degrees in its wake. The cold spots seemed to have purpose, intelligence even. They would often appear in doorways or at the foot of beds, as if standing guard or keeping watch. Our father, ever the pragmatist, initially tried to find logical explanations for everything. He had always been the type to meet uncertainty with research and reason. I would often find him in his office late at night, surrounded by printouts about house settling, local wildlife patterns, and meteorological phenomena. He installed carbon monoxide detectors in every room, had the water tested for contamination, and even hired a structural engineer to examine the foundation. Each investigation came back negative, each rational explanation eliminated, until even he had to admit that something wasn't right. The basement became a particular source of dread. It was unfinished, with rough stone walls that predated the house itself, apparently part of an older foundation that the developers had built upon. The previous owners had used it for storage, leaving behind shelves of preserved foods in mason jars that we never quite got around to clearing out. The preserves looked normal enough, but none of us could shake the feeling that the contents would be something entirely different if we actually opened them. Mother tried to brighten the space by installing additional lighting, but the bulbs burned out with suspicious regularity. Eventually, we gave up trying to keep it fully lit and settled for a single bare bulb that cast long, twisted shadows across the stone walls. It was during one of my rare trips to the basement to retrieve holiday decorations that I noticed the markings. They were subtle at first glance, just irregularities in the stone that could have been natural wear. But as I traced them with my flashlight, a pattern emerged. Symbols had been carved into the foundation stones, worn by time but still discernible. They didn't match any alphabet or writing system I could find in my research, but they had a deliberate quality that suggested meaning. More disturbing was their location. They appeared only on stones that faced the woods, as if forming a boundary or barrier. Winter approached slowly that year, but with an inevitability that felt almost purposeful. The trees behind our house held onto their leaves longer than those in the surrounding forest, creating an unnaturally dense canopy that seemed to absorb both light and sound. When the leaves finally did fall, they did so all at once, on a perfectly still night in late November. The sound woke us all, a sustained rustle that lasted for hours, like countless whispered conversations occurring just beyond our walls. That's when we started noticing the scratching sounds in the walls. At first, we attributed them to mice or squirrels seeking shelter from the cold. Father set traps throughout the house, but they remained untouched. The sounds continued, moving through the walls in patterns that seemed to follow us from room to room. They were loudest at night, of course. Sometimes they would stop abruptly if you pressed your ear to the wall, only to resume from a different location, as if whatever made them knew it was being listened for. The voices began so gradually that I sometimes wonder if they had been there all along, merely waiting for us to become attuned enough to hear them. They started as whispers, barely audible above the winter wind that howled through the bare branches of the woods. At first we rationalized them as natural sounds, branches scraping against siding, wind finding its way through gaps in the weather stripping, or the house's normal settling sounds. But there was an intentionality to them that became impossible to ignore. They would respond to our conversations, mimicking the cadence of our speech patterns, but twisted somehow, like hearing a familiar song played in a minor key. The voices seemed to take particular interest in Madeline and me, perhaps sensing our youth and vulnerability. They would call our names in the dark, using tones and inflections that perfectly matched our parents' voices, but always with something subtly wrong, a slight elongation of vowels, an emphasis on the wrong syllables. I remember one particular night in mid-December with painful clarity. I was up late studying for finals, my desk positioned near the window that overlooked the backyard. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and ice crystals had formed intricate patterns on the glass patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when viewed directly. Around midnight I heard what sounded like someone calling my name from the woods. The voice was eerily familiar. It was my mother's voice, but with an undertone that made my skin crawl. "Come look," it called, using the exact phrase and intonation my mother had used countless times during my childhood when she wanted to show me something interesting. But my actual mother was asleep in her room across the hall. I could hear her soft snoring through the wall. Despite every instinct screaming at me to look away, I found myself drawn to the window. The moon was full that night, casting stark shadows across the snow-covered yard. What I saw there made my blood run cold. At the edge of the woods, something moved in a way that nothing natural should move. It was like watching a shadow detach itself from the darkness, flowing between the trees with liquid grace. The movement was both fascinating and deeply wrong, like watching a time-lapse video of decay in reverse. The worst part wasn't the movement itself, but the awareness behind it. The thing was performing for me, putting on a show that it knew I couldn't look away from. It would pause occasionally, seeming to gauge my reaction, before continuing its impossible dance between the trees. I noticed with growing horror that it never completely emerged from the shadows. Instead, it seemed to wear them like a cloak, bending the darkness around itself in ways that defied physics. When I finally managed to tear myself away from the window and draw the curtains, the voice changed. It was no longer using my mother's tones, but instead spoke in a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The words were unclear, but the meaning felt malevolent, almost mocking. I spent the rest of the night with my back pressed against the wall, listening as that thing circled our house until dawn, its movement marked by the crunch of snow and the occasional scrape of something sharp against the siding. The next morning I examined the house's exterior. Deep gouges marked the walls at irregular intervals, forming patterns that reminded me of the symbols in the basement. But these were fresh, still dusted with powdered paint and wood. When I showed them to my father, he blamed raccoons, but his voice shook slightly as he said it, and he spent the rest of the day installing motion-activated lights around the property. The lights proved worse than the darkness. They would trigger at random intervals throughout the night, illuminating empty spaces where something had been just seconds before. Sometimes they would catch glimpses of movement at the edge of their range, quick flickers of something that wasn't quite there, like trying to see a shadow in your peripheral vision. After a week, we disconnected them. The darkness at least left room for doubt. The lights only confirmed our worst fears. The incident that still haunts me most happened to my sister Madeline in the depths of that endless winter. January had wrapped our world in silence, the heavy snow muffling all sound except for the persistent whispers from the woods. The cold had become a living thing, seeping through the walls despite our furnace running constantly, creating patches of frost on interior walls that formed patterns too regular to be natural. Madeline had always been more sensitive to the house's peculiarities than the rest of us. She had an artist's eye for detail and kept a sketchbook filled with drawings of things she glimpsed through windows or in mirrors, shapes that would vanish when anyone else tried to look. Those sketches grew increasingly disturbing as winter progressed. showing twisted forms that seemed to shift and change even on the static paper. The night it happened was marked by an unusual clarity. The moon was full, hanging low and bloated in the sky, casting stark shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The temperature had dropped well below zero, creating an absolute stillness, broken only by the occasional sharp crack of trees splitting in the cold. Madeline later told me she had woken suddenly, though she couldn't say what had roused her. The wrong feeling, as she called it, pressed against her chest like a physical weight. Her room, normally cluttered with the typical chaos of a teenager, had been meticulously arranged while she slept, every object aligned at precise right angles, all facing toward her window. The neighbor's security light cast a harsh glow through her curtains, but the shadow it projected was impossible. It took the form of a deer's head, complete with a massive rack of antlers, yet everything about its proportions was fundamentally wrong. The angles were too sharp, the dimensions too elongated to belong to any natural creature. Most disturbing was its solidity. Despite the wind that had picked up outside, the shadow remained perfectly still, as if it were painted on the curtain. Madeline lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the shadow maintained its vigil. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, a trick of light and wind, but then it moved. Not the natural movement of a shadow following its source, but a deliberate turning of the head to face her directly. The antlers shifted and multiplied in ways that defied physical law, creating patterns that hurt her eyes to look at. The shadow remained for exactly 3 hours. We know this because every clock in the house stopped at that moment, starting again only when the thing finally vanished. It didn't fade or gradually disappear. It simply ceased to exist between one blink and the next, leaving behind a perfect silence and a cold so intense it had frosted over the inside of Madeline's window. When she finally found the courage to move, Madeline discovered that her sketchbook had been opened to a blank page. Across it, in handwriting that was almost but not quite her own, was written a single phrase in what we later identified as Old English. "We see you seeing us." The next morning we investigated the area outside her window. The snow below was pristine, unmarked by any tracks or disturbances. The neighbor's security light had burned out, its bulb not merely dead but crystallized from within, forming patterns similar to those we'd found in the basement. When we measured the angle of where any shadow should have fallen, we found it mathematically impossible for anything to have cast a shadow on Madeline's window from that position. More disturbing were the changes in Madeline herself. The incident left her with a heightened awareness of things the rest of us could barely perceive. She began to notice patterns in seemingly random events. The way birds would fall silent in sequence as something unseen moved through the woods, the subtle shifts in air pressure that preceded each supernatural occurrence. She started sleeping with her lights on, though she admitted this only made the shadows deeper and more purposeful. Spring arrived that year like a held breath finally released, but it brought no relief from the strangeness that had taken root in our lives. The melting snow revealed patterns in our yard-dead patches of grass, forming complex geometric shapes that seemed to shift position when viewed from different windows. As the days grew longer, we realized that longer light didn't mean safety. It just meant we could see more of what had previously been hidden by darkness. The first scream came on an unusually mild April evening. Our father, maintaining his habit of trying to pretend everything was normal, had left the front door open to let in the spring breeze. We were all in the living room, half watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures, when the sound shattered the quiet night. It came from the direction of the cow pasture, a sound that began almost human before twisting into something that shouldn't exist in our reality. The initial scream had a quality that defied description. It contained elements of a wolf's howl, a woman's cry, and something else, something older than human speech. It set off an immediate chain reaction. Every dog in the neighborhood began barking frantically, their usual territorial warnings transformed into sounds of pure terror. The cattle in the pasture, previously settling down for the night, erupted into panic, forming tight circles with their young in the center. But worse than the first scream were those that followed. Each new cry seemed closer than the last, moving in a deliberate pattern that we later mapped out, a spiral closing in on our house. The The sounds contained layers of complexity that shouldn't have been possible from a single source. Sometimes they seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if whatever made them could be in several places simultaneously. The temperature dropped dramatically as the screams approached, frost forming on our windows despite the mild spring air. We huddled together in the living room, all pretense of skepticism abandoned. Even our father, who had maintained his rationalist stance through everything else, looked shaken. His hands trembled as he tried to call the police, only to find that every phone in the house, cell phones included, displayed the same message: no signal available. The screams continued for exactly 17 minutes. We knew because every clock in the house had stopped again, just as they had during Madeline's encounter. When they finally ceased, the silence that followed was somehow worse. It felt thick, expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, jumping at every creak and settling sound the house made. When dawn finally came, we found evidence that the previous night hadn't been a shared hallucination. Deep tracks marked the earth of our front yard, tracks that started abruptly in the middle of the lawn and disappeared just as suddenly. They resembled deer prints, but were wrong somehow, too deep, too regularly spaced, and occasionally showing signs of impossible angles, as if whatever made them could bend its legs in ways that would shatter any earthly creature's bones. More disturbing were the patterns we found drawn in the dew on our windows. Complex symbols, similar to those in the basement but more elaborate, covered every pane of glass facing the woods. They faded as the sun rose higher, but Madeline managed to sketch several of them in her notebook before they disappeared completely. Months later, we would discover similar symbols in centuries-old church records, described as warnings against those who walk between shadows. After the night of the screams, I began researching obsessively, driven by a need to understand what we were dealing with. The local library became my sanctuary, though even there I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The building itself was old, one of the original structures in town, and its basement archives held records dating back to the first European settlements in the area. My initial searches focused on the history of our property. The house was relatively new, built in the 1990s, but the land it stood on had a darker history. Before the subdivision was built, it had been part of a larger farm property. The family who owned it, the Whitakers, had disappeared without explanation in 1947. Their farmhouse, which had stood approximately where our house now was, had burned to the ground shortly after. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but newspaper accounts from the time mentioned strange symbols found carved into the foundation stones. Stones that I now realized had been incorporated into our basement walls. Going further back, I discovered that the Whitakers weren't the first to vanish from that land. In 1888, a hunting lodge had stood near the edge of the woods. Its owner, a wealthy industrialist named Montgomery Pierce, had written extensively in his journals about movements in the trees and voices that speak in tongues unknown to man. His final entry, dated November 13, 1888, contained a crude drawing of what appeared to be a deer-like figure standing upright, with proportions that matched what we had seen. Pierce and his entire household vanished during a winter storm that same year. The Native American history of the area proved even more enlightening, though much of it had been deliberately obscured or destroyed by early settlers. I found translations of oral histories that spoke of a place where the shadows walk upright and the voices of the hungry ones echo. These accounts consistently warned against building permanent structures in that area, describing it as a thin place where the boundary between worlds had worn away. Two possibilities kept surfacing in my research: the skinwalker of Navajo legend and the Wendigo of Algonquian-speaking peoples' mythology. The skinwalker, a malevolent witch who could transform into any animal, seemed to fit some aspects of our experiences. The mimicry of voices, the impossible movements, the sense of intelligent malice behind the encounters, all were consistent with skinwalker lore. But the Wendigo resonated more deeply with what we'd seen and heard. The deer-like appearance, the screams, the way it seemed to become more active during the coldest months, these aligned perfectly with traditional Wendigo descriptions. The fact that we were in Michigan, historically Algonquian territory, lent additional weight to this theory. I found an academic paper from 1972 that documented similar incidents across the region. Dr. Eleanor Blackstone, a folklore professor from the University of Michigan, had collected accounts spanning over a century. Her research was never published officially. The paper I found was a draft copy, tucked away in the archive's restricted section. Dr. Blackstone herself had disappeared while conducting field research in the area, leaving behind only her notes and a series of increasingly disturbing audio recordings. The recordings, preserved on magnetic tape and transferred to digital format by a previous archivist, contained interviews with local residents about their experiences. One account in particular stood out, an elderly woman describing events from her childhood in 1923 that perfectly matched what Madeline had experienced at her window. The woman's description of the shadow's movements, the impossible angles of its antlers, even the way it seemed to be performing for its audience, all of it aligned with our experiences in ways that couldn't be coincidental. More disturbing were the patterns that emerged from these collected accounts. The incidents seemed to follow a cycle, becoming more intense every 30 years. If my calculations were correct, we had moved into the house just as one of these cycles was reaching its peak. The previous documented cycle in the mid-1980s had culminated in the disappearance of 3 families from the area within a single month. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that we were dealing with something ancient and malevolent, something that had claimed the woods behind our house as its territory long before human settlement. The entity seemed to follow rules, patterns that could be discerned if you knew where to look. It was bound to the woods but could influence the surrounding area. It seemed to gain strength from fear and attention, yet paradoxically sought out witnesses to its manifestations. My research took an unexpected turn when I discovered a small collection of letters in the archive's restricted section. They were written in 1876 by a Catholic priest, Father Michael O'Malley, who had been sent to investigate reports of strange occurrences in the area. His early letters were skeptical, attributing the incidents to mass hysteria or natural phenomena, but his later correspondence became increasingly desperate, describing encounters that matched our own experiences with frightening accuracy. Father O'Malley's final letter, dated December 21, 1876, contained a detailed drawing of symbols identical to those we'd found in our basement. His accompanying note suggested they were meant to be protective wards, but warned that they were double-edged swords that could also serve as anchors, binding the entity more firmly to our reality. The priest disappeared shortly after writing this letter, though local records showed no official investigation into his fate. The last incident occurred exactly 1 year after the first screams. Despite our newfound knowledge and precautions, a simple oversight, the front door left open on a mild evening, invited the final confrontation. The screams started just as they had before, but now they carried purpose. The sounds formed patterns we recognized from the ancient texts I'd studied, words in a language too old for human tongues. The entity moved with deliberate intent, starting from the woods, crossing the cow pasture, and approaching our house with methodical precision. Standing in the living room, I watched through the open door as it finally revealed itself fully. The creature emerged from the darkness like smoke given form, its body a twisted amalgamation of human and deer features. It stood impossibly tall, its antlers scraping against our second-story windows. The moonlight seemed to bend around it, creating shadows that moved independently of their source. In that moment, we understood what the ancient texts meant about those who walk between. The entity existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, parts of it disappearing and reappearing as it moved, its form defying physical laws. Our father slammed the door shut, but we spent that night listening to it circle the house, its claws leaving deep grooves in the siding. The markings it left weren't random. They matched the symbols from the basement, but reversed, as if it were unraveling the ancient protections. We moved out within the month. The official reason was my father's job transfer, but we all knew the truth. Some places aren't meant for human habitation. Some territories remain the domain of older, darker things that predate our civilization. Years have passed, but the experience has marked us all. Madeline became an artist, her work filled with hidden symbols and shadowy forms that gallery critics praise for their otherworldly quality. Our parents rarely speak of that year, though Mother still won't sleep in rooms with uncovered windows. The house still stands, occupied by new families who come and go with suspicious regularity. I've driven past it occasionally, always during daylight hours. The woods behind it seem darker somehow, more dense than the surrounding forest. Sometimes, if I look carefully, I can see something moving between the trees, something that doesn't quite match the movement of the branches in the wind. This is the first time I've written about these events. Part of me fears that putting these words to paper might attract its attention again. The old texts warn that these entities can be summoned simply by thinking about them too intently. But the weight of keeping this secret has become too heavy, and perhaps sharing this account will help others recognize the signs before it's too late. I still dream about it sometimes. The shadow at the window, the impossible screams, the thing that emerged from the darkness on that final night. In these dreams, it's always watching, waiting, calling me back to those woods. And sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, I catch myself wanting to answer. The late autumn wind whipped across the rolling hills of Kentucky horse country, carrying with it the first bitter bite of winter. I'd been working at Willow Creek Farm for just over 3 months, and already the shorter days were casting longer shadows across the weathered wooden barns and frost-covered paddocks. The property sprawled across 800 acres of prime bluegrass country, its history as deep as the limestone beneath our feet. I learned early on about the graves. They dotted the property like quiet sentinels, some marked with worn headstones dating back to the 1800s, others known only through carefully preserved property records and oral histories passed down through generations of farmhands. The owners maintained these sites with a reverence that spoke of old Kentucky values, trimming the grass by hand, keeping the horses away with discreet fencing, and welcoming the occasional visitor who came to lay flowers for their long-departed kin. My supervisor, Mrs. Helena Burton, had given me the standard orientation speech about the graves during my first week. "We respect our history here," she'd said, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, weathered hands clasped before her. "These families were here long before us, and their descendants still consider this sacred ground." I'd nodded, thinking little of it at the time. Growing up in Kentucky, you get used to history being ever-present, to old homesteads and family plots being part of the landscape. I was assigned to the North Barn, an imposing structure of hand-hewn beams and mortared stone that had stood for over a century. My barn partner, Rebecca Walsh, was a veteran of 15 years at Willow Creek, her knowledge of horses matched only by her efficiency. She had a habit of leaving me alone to tend to the barn while she checked the horses in the outlying fields, a responsibility I initially welcomed as a sign of trust. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I settled into the rhythm of barn life, the pre-dawn arrivals, the familiar sense of hay and leather, the comfortable routine of feeding and cleaning. But as November deepened and the days grew shorter, I began to notice things. Small things at first, easily dismissed. The sound of footsteps when I knew I was alone, the sensation of being watched while mucking stalls, the occasional whinny from what I knew to be an empty stall. It was during a particularly cold morning in early December when I had my first undeniable experience. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the frost-covered paddocks in shades of pale gold. Rebecca had left to do her morning field check, leaving me alone in the barn with our single-occupied stall, a young thoroughbred recovering from a minor injury. I was at the far end of the barn, focused on cleaning the last empty stall when I heard them. 2 distinct male voices engaged in conversation. The acoustics of the old barn made it impossible to make out their words, but the cadence was clear, one voice deep and authoritative, the other lighter and deferential. My first thought was that it must be Mr. Burton and one of the veterinarians making an early morning visit. Brushing off my gloves, I stepped out into the barn aisle, ready to greet them. The voices continued, seeming to come from the entrance about 60 feet away. But when I rounded the corner, I found only empty space and silence. The gravel drive outside showed no tire tracks, no footprints in the frost. The The morning was still except for the soft nickering of our lone horse. I stood there for several long moments, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. The wind playing tricks perhaps, or sounds carrying from one of the other barns. But I knew with a certainty that settled cold in my stomach that these explanations weren't sufficient. The voices had been too clear, too present. That incident marked the beginning of what would become a regular occurrence of inexplicable events. A few days later, while taking my lunch break in the small room we used as an office, I heard it. The distinctive sound of someone walking down the barn aisle with a lead rope. Click, click, click. The rhythm was unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around horses, the sound of a brass clip swaying against itself with each step. I rose from my chair, sandwich forgotten, and peered out the office window that overlooked the barn aisle. Nothing. No movement, no shadow, just the empty corridor stretching away in both directions. Yet the sound continued for several more steps before fading away. The incidents began to multiply. The rattle of feed buckets being hung on stall doors, 3 sharp metallic clasps clicking into place, a sound I'd heard hundreds of times during feeding. But when I went to check, the buckets hung undisturbed exactly where I'd left them. Sometimes it was the soft thud of rubber boots on wooden floors, other times the scrape of a pitchfork against concrete, all the normal sounds of barn work, but occurring when no one was there to make them. As winter deepened, so did my discomfort. The early darkness meant spending more time in the barn under artificial light, the old fluorescent fixtures creating pools of harsh illumination separated by deeper shadows. I began to develop habits, keeping my back to walls whenever possible, glancing over my shoulder more frequently, rushing through tasks in the more isolated areas of the barn. Rebecca noticed my growing tension but seemed unsurprised. One evening, as we were finishing up our final checks, I finally confided in her about what I'd been experiencing. We sat in the office, steam rising from our coffee cups as I recounted each incident. "Everyone who's worked here long enough has stories," she said, her expression thoughtful. "This barn's been here since 1891. Think about how many people have worked here, lived here, died here." She paused, considering her next words. "Last spring I was doing night check during foaling season. There was no one else around, and I heard what sounded like a horse moving around in stall 12. You know, the big one at the end? The sound of hooves on brick rustling in straw, even breathing and snorting. But that stall was empty. Had been for weeks. Hasn't had straw in it for years. Just bare brick floor." The incident that truly shook me occurred in mid-December. Rebecca and I were finishing up evening feeds, the winter night already pitch black outside our islands of fluorescent light. We were discussing the next day's schedule when we both heard it. A woman's laugh, clear as day, coming from around the corner near the tack room. It wasn't a malicious sound, rather, it was light and musical, the kind of laugh you might hear during a pleasant conversation. But its very normalcy made it all the more chilling in the empty barn. Rebecca and I exchanged glances, and without a word we both moved to investigate. The tack room and surrounding area were empty, of course. We checked every stall, every corner, even stepped outside to scan the surroundings with our flashlights. The farm was silent except for the winter wind and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. "That's a new one," Rebecca said quietly as we returned to our tasks. "Usually it's just the men's voices or the work sounds." Her casual acceptance of the supernatural occurrence somehow made it more real, more unsettling. My curiosity, fueled by equal parts fear and fascination, led me to dig into the farm's history. The local historical society maintained extensive records, and the farm's current owners had preserved many documents from previous generations. What I found painted a picture of life and death on a working horse farm spanning more than a century. The North Barn had been built by the Hamilton family, who owned this portion of what would become Willow Creek Farm. Census records showed a constant stream of workers living on the property: grooms, trainers, stable hands. Death certificates revealed accidents, illnesses, lives lived and ended among these very stalls where I now worked. One account particularly caught my attention, a notation from 1923 about a young woman named Margaret, who had worked as a trainer's assistant. She was described as having a memorable laugh and being especially good with difficult horses. She died of influenza that winter, and according to the records, was buried in one of the small family plots on the property. As winter progressed, the activity in the barn seemed to increase. The sounds became more frequent, and new manifestations began to appear. The most significant was the shadow figure I glimpsed one evening while closing up. I was walking down the center aisle, checking that all the stall doors were secured, when movement caught my eye. At the far end of the barn, silhouetted against the security light that illuminated the entrance, a dark figure moved across the doorway. It was distinctly human in shape, but seemed to lack any detail, just a black silhouette that passed from one side of the door to the other, in a smooth, silent motion. My first instinct was to call out, thinking it might be another worker, but something stopped me. Perhaps the absolute silence of the movement, or the way the figure seemed too dark, too solid against the background light. I stood frozen, watching as the shadow passed back across the doorway in the opposite direction, then simply ceased to be. That was the moment I truly understood why people speak of their blood running cold. I felt a physical chill spread through my body, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone's flashlight. The barn entrance, when I finally gathered the courage to investigate, was empty and undisturbed. As I write this now, several months have passed since my first encounters with the unexplained at Willow Creek Farm. The incidents continue, though they've taken on a different character in my mind. What once inspired fear now prompts a complex mixture of emotions: respect, curiosity, and a deep awareness of the layers of history that surround us. I've learned to coexist with the echoes of the past that linger in the North Barn. The voices, the footsteps, the phantom sounds of daily work. They've become part of the barn's character, as much a part of its identity as the weathered beams and worn floorboards. Even the shadow figure, while still unsettling, seems less malevolent than it did at first. Perhaps just another echo of someone going about their duties, caught in an endless loop of time. Rebecca tells me this acceptance is common among long-term workers at Willow Creek. The way I see it, she said recently, they're just doing what we're doing, taking care of the horses, keeping the barn running. They're just doing it from their side of time. The graves scattered across the property have taken on new significance for me. I find myself paying more attention to them during my daily rounds, noting the names and dates, wondering about the lives they represent. Sometimes, when I hear those phantom footsteps or distant voices, I imagine I'm sharing the space with those who came before, all of us connected by our devotion to these magnificent animals and this historic place. The experience has taught me something about the nature of fear and history. What terrifies us at first, the unknown, the inexplicable, can become almost comfortable when we accept it as part of a larger story. The North Barn's ghosts, if that's what they are, seem less like supernatural invaders and more like co-workers from a different era, their routines and responsibilities echoing through time alongside our own. As winter gives way to spring, I find myself wondering what new experiences await in the North Barn. The activity seems to ebb and flow with the seasons, but it never entirely ceases. Like the graves that dot the property, like the ancient limestone beneath our feet, like the very walls of the barn itself, these manifestations have become part of the landscape of my daily life. A reminder that in places with deep history, the past is never truly past, but continues to resonate in ways both subtle and profound. Summer in Tennessee hits different when you're 13. The air hangs thick and heavy, like a wet blanket draped across your shoulders, and the cicadas scream their endless chorus into the suffocating heat. It was June 2010 when my mother drove me to Camp Bucktum's, her hands gripping the steering wheel with that determined set to her jaw I'd come to recognize. She'd been pushing the Boy Scouts thing since Dad left, convinced it would build character. I didn't have the heart to tell her I'd rather spend my summer anywhere else. Camp Bucktum sprawled across several hundred acres of dense Tennessee wilderness, about 2 hours east of Nashville. The main entrance was marked by a weathered wooden sign, its carved letters spelling out the camp's name beneath the Boy Scouts emblem. As we pulled into the gravel parking lot, I watched other kids spilling out of their parents' cars, their green uniforms crisp and new-looking compared to my handed-down one. "You'll do great, Ryan," Mom said, squeezing my shoulder. "Troop 417 has been coming here for years. Mr. Walsh says it's the best scout camp in the state." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The truth was, everything about this place set my teeth on edge. Maybe it was the way the dense forest pressed in around the clearing, or how the shadows seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. Even from the parking lot, I could tell the buildings were spread far apart, connected by winding trails that disappeared into the undergrowth. Our troop gathered near the registration cabin, where Mr. Walsh, our scoutmaster, was checking us in. There were 15 of us total, mostly kids I knew from school, though none I'd call close friends. The air smelled of pine needles and decay, that peculiar mustiness that rises from the forest floor in summer. "Listen up, boys," Mr. Walsh called out, his clipboard tucked under one arm. "We're in Campsite Delta, about a quarter-mile from here. Bathroom facilities are shared with 3 other sites located at the trail junction. Showers are another 5 minutes past that. Remember the buddy system? Nobody goes anywhere alone, especially after dark." As we hiked to our campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods were alive with normal summer sounds: birds calling, leaves rustling, distant shouts from other campers. But underneath it all was a tension I couldn't explain. Like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The initial day passed in a blur of setup and orientation. We pitched our tents in a clearing ringed by towering oaks, their branches creating a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns on the ground. The air was thick with humidity, and by evening my uniform was stuck to my back with sweat. It was during the walk to the mess hall for dinner that I first noticed it, the sensation of being watched. We were moving in a group, following the marked trail, when the feeling hit me like a physical weight between my shoulder blades. I stopped, turning to look behind me, but there was nothing there except shadows and trees. "Keep up, Ryan," Mr. Walsh called from the front of the group. "Don't want to miss hot dog night." I hurried to catch up, but the feeling persisted. It wasn't like being watched by a person. This felt older, colder, something that didn't think quite like we did. I tried to rationalize it as normal woods-induced paranoia, the kind of thing that happens to city kids when they're suddenly surrounded by wilderness. But deep down, I knew it was something else. The mess hall was a long, low building with screened windows and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. I sat with my troop, picking at my hot dog while conversations flowed around me. From our table, I could see into the woods through the screens where the darkness was gathering between the trees like spilled ink. "Did you guys notice anything weird on the trail?" I asked Kevin, the kid sitting next to me. He looked up from his food, confused. "Weird how? Like?" I struggled to put it into words. "Like something watching us?" "It's the woods, man," he laughed. "Probably just deer or something. My dad says this place is full of them." But it wasn't deer. I knew what deer felt like. I'd been hunting with my uncle enough times. This was different. This felt intelligent. The second day brought archery practice and knot tying lessons, normal scout activities that should have been boring but safe. Instead, the feeling of wrongness intensified. During archery, I kept seeing movement at the edge of the range, quick darting shapes that vanished when I tried to focus on them. The instructor must have noticed my distraction because he pulled me aside after I missed my 5th shot in a row. "Everything okay, son?" he asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "You seem a bit jumpy today." I wanted to tell him about the shadows, about the way the woods went quiet when you walked alone, about the feeling of being hunted. Instead, I just shrugged. "Just tired, sir. Didn't sleep well." That wasn't a lie. None of us had slept well. The night had been filled with strange sounds, rustling around the tents, soft scratching noises, and once what sounded like breathing right outside the thin nylon wall by my head. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out with my flashlight, there was nothing there except deep claw marks in the dirt. During the afternoon nature hike, I hung toward the middle of the group, trying to ignore the way the trees seemed to lean in over the trail, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers. The guide was pointing out different types of local flora, but I couldn't focus on his words. The feeling of being watched had become constant now, an itch between my shoulder blades that wouldn't go away. The third day was when everything went wrong. The day itself had been hot and sticky, the kind of weather that makes you feel dirty no matter what you do. After dinner, Mr. Walsh announced the usual shower schedule. Most of the troop headed out together, but I hung back, my stomach churning at the thought of the communal showers. "I'll wait," I told him, hoping he'd understand. His face softened slightly. "That's fine, Ryan, but I can't spare anyone to wait with you. You'll have to go alone." "But what about the buddy system?" I protested, remembering his own warnings from the first day. "Sometimes we have to make exceptions," he said, already turning away. "Just don't take too long. Be back before full dark." I waited in the empty campsite, watching the sun sink lower through the trees. When the rest of the troop returned, chattering and clean, it was already twilight. The shadows were long and deep, and the woods had taken on that peculiar quality they get at dusk, where familiar shapes become strange and threatening. Gathering my shower supplies and towel, I set out on the trail. The distance to the shower building seemed longer now that I was alone, each step taking me deeper into the gathering darkness. I talked to myself as I walked, trying to fill the silence with something human. "This is stupid," I muttered. "Nothing to be afraid of. Just woods, just regular old Tennessee woods." But they weren't regular woods anymore. The normal evening sounds, the chirping of crickets, the calls of night birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, had gone completely silent. The silence was absolute, pressing against my ears like cotton wool, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. I was about halfway to the showers when I heard it, a low, wet sound, like someone trying to breathe through a mouthful of fluid. It came from somewhere off to my left in the deeper shadows between the trees. My feet stopped moving of their own accord, every muscle in my body going rigid with primal fear. The sound came again, closer now, accompanied by the snap of a branch and the rustle of leaves. Something was moving through the undergrowth, something that didn't care about being quiet anymore. The rational part of my brain tried to categorize it. Not a deer, too deliberate. Not a bear, too quiet. Not a person. The movement was wrong, all wrong. I ran. The shower building loomed ahead, its concrete walls pale in the dying light. I hit the door at full speed, yanking it open and diving inside. The fluorescent lights flickered and hummed, casting harsh shadows in the tiled space. My eyes darted around, looking for somewhere to hide. The shower stalls themselves were just open cubicles, no good. But there, in the corner, was a supply closet for towels and cleaning supplies. I squeezed inside, pulling the door shut as quietly as possible. The space was tight, barely big enough for me to stand, and it smelled of bleach and mildew. Through a crack where the door hadn't quite closed properly, I could see a slice of the main room. For 2 minutes there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then the outer door creaked open. What entered the shower building wasn't human. Its movements were too fluid, too wrong, like watching a spider move in stop motion. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and impossibly thin, its pale skin stretched tight over jutting bones. Where its face should have been, there was a nightmare. No lips, revealing blackened gums and teeth that looked like they had been stained with rust. Its eyes, God, its eyes were like looking into empty wells, bottomless and hungry. The creature moved through the shower room in a series of jerky, unsettling motions, its head twitching from side to side like a bird's. Its hands, if you could call them hands, ended in long curved claws that clicked against the tile floor as it walked. The sound echoed in the empty building, a steady tap-tap-tap that made my skin crawl. I pressed myself further back into the closet, trying to make myself as small as possible. My lungs were burning. I realized I'd been holding my breath. The thing paused, its head snapping toward the closet door, and I felt my heart stop. It knew, it had to know. Those empty eyes seemed to stare directly at my hiding place, and I could smell it now, a sickly, sweet odor of decay and something else, something chemical and wrong. The creature took a step toward the closet, then another. I could hear it breathing now, a wet, raspy sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside its chest. My vision started to blur with tears I refused to let fall, knowing that any sound might give me away. Then, unexpectedly, voices echoed from outside, another group of scouts heading to the showers. The creature's head whipped toward the sound, and with a movement too quick to follow, it was gone. The outer door hadn't even opened. It was just there one moment and gone the next, like a nightmare fading in the morning light. I stayed in that closet for what felt like hours, my legs cramping and my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. When the other troop finally entered, their normal teenage chatter seemed obscene after what I'd witnessed. Their scoutmaster found me when he heard movement in the closet, probably expecting to catch someone playing a prank. "Son," he said, concern evident in his voice when he saw my state. "Are you all right?" I couldn't speak, could barely shake my head. He must have seen something in my face that worried him because he immediately took charge of the situation, leading me to the private shower in their nearby campsite. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. Couldn't find the words to describe it even if I'd wanted to. The walk back to my own campsite was a blur. The scoutmaster insisted on accompanying me, probably thinking I'd had some kind of panic attack. Maybe I had, but I knew what I'd seen, knew it was real with the same certainty that I knew my own name. When I got back to my tent, I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to the sounds outside, jumping at every rustle and crack. Somewhere in the distance I heard that same raspy growl, but it seemed farther away now, as if the thing had found other prey to hunt. The next morning I called my mother from the camp office. I told her I was sick, that I needed to come home. She must have heard something in my voice because she didn't argue, didn't try to convince me to stick it out. She arrived 2 hours later to pick me up. As we drove away from Camp Bucktum's, I watched the trees through the car window. Something moved in the shadows of the forest, something tall and pale that seemed to keep pace with the car for a moment before falling behind. I never told my mother what happened that night. I quit the Boy Scouts the following week, and she didn't fight me on that either. Years have passed since then, but I still think about what I saw in those Tennessee woods. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees just right, I hear that raspy breathing again, and I wonder about all the other kids who've gone to Camp Bucktum since then, if they've seen what I saw, if they've felt those empty eyes watching them from the shadows, because I know it's still there, waiting in those deep woods, waiting for someone else to walk alone in the gathering dark, to stray just far enough from safety. And if you ever find yourself at Camp Bucktum's, remember this: when the woods go quiet, when you feel those eyes on your back, don't run. They say that's when it likes to chase. Just walk calmly back to your campsite, back to the lights and the voices and the safety of numbers. And whatever you do, don't look behind you, because sometimes, just sometimes, it's closer than you think.